The Madam Who Shot the Mountie, Big Nelly Webb and the Night Edmonton Lost Control. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Author's note, method, limits, and the shape of the record. This book has insisted on a simple discipline, to follow what can be supported, and to name what cannot. Historical true crime is often written as if the past were a stage we can fully light, with every figure clearly visible, every motive intelligible, every gap comfortably filled. The archive does not permit that. The archive preserves what institutions needed to preserve, what officials chose to record, what newspapers chose to print, and what communities later found enjoyable enough to repeat. It is not a neutral container of truth. It is a set of surviving fragments shaped by power. In a case like Big Nelly Webb's, the imbalance is immediate. The most durable documents are legal and institutional: reports, charges, court proceedings, medical descriptions. These documents preserve the state's concerns: procedure, authority, injury, verdict. They preserve the event as an administrative problem solved. They do not preserve the women's full lives. They do not preserve the interior texture of brothel work. They do not preserve private fear except as it appears in testimony. They do not preserve the long aftermath except when it creates another collision with authority. So this book has been written with those limits in full view. Where the record is strong, the narrative is concrete. Where the record thins, the narrative does not pretend to know what cannot be known. It stays with what the conditions suggest without inventing private scenes or untraceable dialogue. The goal is not to drain the story of life. The goal is to keep the story honest. Language and the problem of labels. This case survives through labels that were never innocent. Madam. House of ill fame. Prostitute. Fallen. Inmate. Such words are not merely descriptive. They are moral tools. They decide who is credible, who is violable, who is protected, who is punishable, and whose fear can be dismissed as unreasonable. This book uses the historical terminology where necessary to reflect the social conditions of the period, but it refuses the moral function those terms were designed to perform. The women inside these spaces are treated as workers and as human beings, not as scenery for male drama. The uniform is treated similarly. Constable, mounted police, lawman, these are also labels with social power. They confer assumed credibility. They encourage the reader, even now, to place the injured officer at the center and treat the women as peripheral. The record itself encourages this. The book has deliberately resisted it. Why the narrative centers the threshold. Many accounts reduce the Webb case to a single sensational line: a madam shot a Mountie. That line is not false, but it is incomplete in a way that protects the wrong parties. It makes the gunshot the beginning rather than the end of a sequence. It turns self-defense into spectacle and forced entry into background noise. It allows police entitlement to remain unexamined. The most revealing element of the record is not the bullet. It is the broken door. The door is the physical stubborn proof that this was not a social misunderstanding. It was an escalation to force. It was the moment a tolerated illegal space became a place where a woman tried to enforce a boundary against men who believed their authority made boundaries optional. That is why the narrative has returned, repeatedly, to the threshold. It is where the system's contradictions become visible. A note on tone. This book is written in a restrained voice on purpose. The temptation in true crime is always to heighten, to dramatize, to moralize, to assign villains and saints. But the record does not require heightening. The facts are already sharp. The work here is not to make them louder. It is to keep them clear. Restraint also honors the subject. A woman's life should not be used as a stage for a narrator's excitement. Neither should a town's hypocrisy be treated as entertainment. So the prose stays quiet, even when the facts are not. What is missing, and why it matters. The most conspicuous absence in this case is the sustained biographical record of Webb's later life. She is highly visible at the moment of scandal and then, like so many women on the margins, she becomes harder to trace. This is not an accident of chance. It is how archives work. Institutions preserve people most clearly when they need them, as defendants, witnesses, offenders, problems to be managed. Once the crisis ends, the person can vanish from the administrative view. That vanishing does not mean her life became simple. It means the system stopped recording it. The absence itself is part of the book's argument. The state can make a woman visible as a symbol and then let her dissolve as a human being. How to read the case without romance. It is tempting to romanticize Webb, either as a frontier heroine who stood up to the Mounties, or as a dangerous woman who got away with it. Both romances are distortions. The record shows something more sobering and more instructive, a woman defending a boundary because the law could not be relied on to defend her. The acquittal shows that the town briefly acknowledged the boundary. It does not show that the town transformed. Survival is not the same as liberation. An acquittal is not the same as safety. A famous scandal is not the same as a legible life. A short timeline of key events. October 24, 1888, 2 off-duty NWMP constables arrive at Webb's house at night. The door is battered and forced. Webb warns she is armed. A shot is fired. Constable Thomas Kearney is wounded. Following days, public scandal, gossip, institutional scrambling. Guards and conduct become part of the story. The town's ridicule exposes reputational damage. Court proceedings. The case is framed as a self-defense question. Forced entry and the threshold become central. Verdict: Webb is acquitted on the grounds of self-defense. Aftermath: the town reseals its bargain with vice. The story hardens into folklore. Webb's later life becomes less visible in the record. Dramatis personae. Big Nelly Webb, madam and housekeeper at the center of the case. Defendant, acquitted on self-defense. Constable Thomas Kearney, NWMP, off-duty officer wounded at Webb's door, surviving witness and symbol around which authority sought to gather. Second Constable, NWMP, off-duty companion present during the attempted entry, part of the night's escalation and later narrative pressure. The women in the house, workers and witnesses whose vulnerability and credibility are structurally constrained by criminalization and moral judgment. Edmonton, not a passive setting, but an actor, a town negotiating its dependence on vice and its need to appear orderly. Preface. Edmonton did not lose control all at once. It loosened first. In the late 1880s, the town existed in a familiar frontier condition, growing faster than its institutions could comfortably manage, reliant on informal arrangements it publicly denied, and governed as much by habit as by law. Order was not absent, but it was negotiated nightly, between police and publicans, between magistrates and businessmen, between respectability and the businesses that made respectability possible. Brothels were part of that negotiation. They were illegal, known, tolerated, and quietly useful. They absorbed violence, drink, and male restlessness in spaces designed to contain them. They kept disorder from spilling too far into the street, until they didn't. Everyone understood the arrangement, even if no one admitted it. The police enforced the law selectively. The town benefited. The contradiction held. Until the night it didn't. On a cold October night in 1888, that contradiction broke at a doorway. 2 Northwest Mounted Police constables, off-duty and drunk, arrived at a brothel run by a woman known as Big Nelly Webb. What followed was not a planned confrontation, not a moral crusade, and not a lawful raid. It was an escalation born of entitlement, alcohol, and a belief that certain spaces, and certain women, could be entered without consequence. The door did not open. Threats followed. Wood splintered. A warning was given. A leg came through the frame. Nelly Webb fired. The shot did not kill the constable, but it wounded something more fragile than a body. It wounded the illusion that Edmonton's order was firm, neutral, and competently enforced. Within hours, the shooting had become a civic embarrassment. Within days, it had exposed the quiet arrangements that kept the town functioning. Within weeks, it had forced the justice system to decide which parts of its own behaviour it could afford to see clearly. This book begins there, not with the brothel, not with vice, not with moral judgment, but with the moment the bargain failed. This is not a book about a heroic madam or a fallen woman redeemed by violence. It is not a morality play about prostitution, nor a celebration of frontier defiance. It is a fact-based historical true crime study of a single event and its consequences. What happened when a woman who ran an illegal business used lethal force against a representative of the law, and the law was forced to respond without collapsing its own credibility. The shooting mattered because it could not be absorbed quietly. A madam shooting a Mountie is not merely an act of violence. It is a category violation. It destabilizes the hierarchy that allows tolerated illegality to exist. It raises questions the system prefers not to answer. Who is entitled to force? Who is protected by the law when the law itself behaves badly? What happens when police misconduct is not abstract, but drunk, loud, and kicking in a door? These are not abstract questions. They are institutional ones. Edmonton in the 1880s depended on the mounted police to project order. The NWMP were more than law enforcement, they were a symbol of colonial authority and national competence. Their legitimacy mattered. Their behaviour mattered more. Big Nelly Webb's business depended on a different legitimacy, one that could never be formalized. Her brothel existed because the town needed it and pretended not to. That need did not translate into protection. It translated into vulnerability. When the Mounties arrived at her door that night, they did not arrive as neutral officers enforcing the law. They arrived as men accustomed to access. The line between authority and entitlement blurred quickly. The law that criminalized Webb did not shield her from intrusion. It merely ensured that, if she resisted, she would be the one on trial. And yet, this time, she was not. That is the heart of the case. The trial that followed is often remembered for its outcome, acquittal on the grounds of self-defense. But the verdict alone does not explain the case. What matters is what the trial allowed the town to say, and what it allowed the town to avoid saying. It allowed Edmonton to condemn drunkenness without condemning policing. It allowed the court to recognize self-defense without legitimizing brothels. It allowed the system to isolate the event as an aberration rather than a symptom. Most importantly, it allowed order to be reasserted without examining the bargain that had made the night possible in the first place. This book traces that process carefully, event by event. The structure is deliberately event-led. The night comes first. The aftermath follows. The institutions respond. The trial attempts to contain meaning. The town moves on. Along the way, the story reveals how order on the frontier was not a fixed condition but a negotiated performance, one that depended on silence, selective enforcement, and the careful management of embarrassment. When that performance failed, the system did not collapse. It adapted. Big Nelly Webb survived the case not because the system suddenly embraced her, but because the system needed a way out that did not involve admitting too much about itself. That distinction matters. Like the trunk murders and the stagecoach robbery, this book is written with restraint. It relies on contemporary reporting, legal proceedings, and institutional context. It avoids speculation where the record is thin and resists turning a complex case into a parable of empowerment or villainy. The narrator does not intrude to rescue or condemn. The facts are allowed to do their work. What emerges is not a tale of individual triumph, but a study of how authority behaves when confronted with its own contradictions, when those contradictions are forced into the open by a gunshot in a doorway. Because the most important question raised by this case is not whether Big Nelly Webb was justified in firing. It is this. What kind of order depends on pretending it does not know how it actually works? On one October night in Edmonton, that question became impossible to ignore. This book follows what happened next. Chapter 1, Edmonton After Dark. Edmonton in the late 1880s was not a wilderness outpost. It was a town learning, day by day, how to pretend it had already become a city. By daylight, it practiced competence. Men in respectable coats moved between shops and offices. Teams hauled goods along rutted roads. Notices were posted, payments collected, accounts settled. The river and the fort sat inside the town's sense of itself, proof that this place had structure, that it had history, that it had authority. At night, the town reverted to its older instincts. Darkness did not bring chaos, exactly. It brought negotiation. It brought the world that existed beneath the formal language of law, the arrangements people relied on, the places they visited, the things they did not say in daylight. Edmonton's order was real, but it was not evenly distributed. It was strongest where respectable men wanted it to be strongest, and weakest where they wanted it to be useful. This is where a certain kind of business thrives. A brothel does not flourish because a town has no morals. It flourishes because a town has needs it cannot satisfy within its own public rules. It flourishes because men arrive without wives, without family structures, without the domestic discipline that respectable society claims to value. It flourishes because those men have money, drink, loneliness, and a taste for risk. It flourishes because someone is willing to turn those things into profit. And it flourishes because enforcement, in practice, is never as clean as enforcement on paper. To understand the night Edmonton lost control, it helps to understand how Edmonton controlled itself on most other nights, how the town maintained the illusion of firm law while living off an economy of tolerated illegality. The Northwest Mounted Police existed, in public imagination, as a guarantee. They were meant to project stability across a vast geography. They were meant to embody discipline, uniform, procedure, restraint. Their presence was a statement that this was not simply a rough settlement where anyone could do anything. This was a place where authority could be seen. But authority is not a costume. A uniform can be worn by a man who is tired, drunk, careless, or cruel. The symbol does not always match the behavior. Most of the time, the mismatch can be ignored because it happens in private or because those affected have little power to complain. On the frontier, complaint is a luxury. Even when people complain, they are often ignored. And the people most able to complain are often the people least likely to admit what brought them into a particular place in the first instance. That is one of the quiet shields surrounding vice. It is protected not only by corruption or tolerance, but by mutual embarrassment. Respectable men want a town to have an underworld and also want to deny visiting it. Police want to maintain order and also want to avoid the consequences of exposing the town's private habits. Magistrates want to present justice and also want to avoid court cases that reveal too much. So a pattern forms. Illegal businesses operate openly enough to be known, but quietly enough to be dismissed. Police intervene when they must, but not so fully that they collapse the arrangement that keeps the town's male disorder contained. Town leaders condemn vice in principle while benefiting from the stability that vice, contained, provides. It is not that everyone agrees. It is that everyone adapts. Edmonton was full of adaptation. There were two Edmontons after dark. One was the respectable one, lamplight in windows, families behind doors, the soft rhythms of households shutting down. In that Edmonton, a town could pretend it was already settled, already safe, already properly governed. The other Edmonton was louder. It moved between saloons and rooms, between drinking and gambling, between money spent quickly and nerves calmed badly. It was a world of men who had come for work and found that work did not organize their souls. In that second Edmonton, the language of law often mattered less than the language of access. Who could get in? Who could be refused? Who could demand? Who could threaten? Who could enforce? Those questions do not vanish because a town has police. They become more complicated. Because police are men too. A uniform imposes constraints when worn on duty. Off duty, those constraints loosen. Drink loosens them further. A frontier town offers fewer consequences for behavior that would be punished elsewhere because everyone is watching everyone, and everyone is implicated in someone else's business. In a town like Edmonton, the line between public authority and private appetite could become thin. Thin enough to break. Big Nelly Webb's house sat inside this world. It was not a secret. It did not need to be. Brothels in frontier towns rarely survive by hiding completely. They survive by being known and managed, by being a place everyone can point to and say, yes, that's there, without admitting what it means that it is there. A madam is not merely a sex worker. She is a business operator. She manages a house, a set of women, a flow of customers, a circulation of money, a degree of violence, and a constant risk of intervention. She is required to be practical in ways polite society refuses to acknowledge. She is required to read men accurately and quickly. She is required to know when to accommodate and when to refuse, when to pay quietly and when to stand her ground. If she does not, she does not last. The madam's house is also a kind of civic instrument. It gathers men who would otherwise spill their roughness into streets, bars, and boarding houses. It turns that roughness into a contained transaction. It absorbs and redistributes risk. That is why brothels are tolerated, not because they are approved, but because they are useful. Usefulness creates tolerance. Tolerance creates expectation. Expectation creates entitlement. And entitlement is where the danger begins. A brothel is criminalized space. That label is not merely legal, it is social. It tells everyone that the women inside are not protected in the same way as respectable women. It tells men quietly that ordinary standards may not apply. It tells police that intervention can be framed as enforcement regardless of motive. It tells the community that harm done inside might not be treated as harm in the same way. This is one of the most important and ugliest mechanics of vice regulation. Criminalizing a space can make violence against the people in that space feel less urgent. It does not have to be explicit. It can be unconscious. It can be embedded in the way people speak about those women, in the way a complaint is received, in the way a bruised face is interpreted, in the way a broken door is treated as a consequence rather than a crime. A brothel keeper lives with that knowledge. It shapes how she protects herself. Protection, in such a place, does not always look like the law. It looks like locks, rules, allies, bribes, and sometimes weapons. Because when the law is unreliable, private protection becomes the only thing available. Edmonton's institutions prefer to imagine themselves as clean. Law in one compartment, vice in another. Police on one side of the line, criminals on the other. A neat map. A stable boundary. The reality was messier. Men in uniform could be customers. Men in uniform could be friends of customers. Men in uniform could be drunk and reckless and still wrapped in authority. That authority could be invoked to gain entry, to intimidate, to force compliance. And if something went wrong, the woman running the house would not be treated as a neutral citizen defending her property. She would be treated as a woman defending an illegal business against the state. This is how the system keeps its bargain intact. It tolerates vice as long as vice remains compliant. The moment vice resists, it becomes a convenient enemy. But sometimes vice resists because it must. Sometimes the door stays closed because the people inside know what happens when it opens. On most nights, the arrangement held. Men came and went. Money changed hands. Drink softened tempers. The town's respectable surface remained intact, because the messy part was tucked away behind doors people pretended not to see. The police could tell themselves they maintained order because nothing spilled too far. The town could tell itself it was moral because vice was confined to a known place. The men who visited could tell themselves it did not count because it was just a certain kind of house. This is how social systems protect themselves, by dividing reality into categories and insisting that some categories do not threaten the whole. But a category violation collapses the division. A madam shooting a Mountie is such a violation. It forces the town to confront what it has been managing through denial. Because suddenly the illegal house is not merely an illegal house. It is a site of violent confrontation with authority. Suddenly the men in uniform are not merely symbols of order. They are bodies, drunk and angry, forcing entry. Suddenly the moral line the town relies on is not a line at all. It is a story the town tells itself. And now the story is bleeding. It is worth pausing over the climate of that night, not in the sense of weather, but in the sense of human atmosphere. The late hours in a frontier town are thick with small tensions. Drink produces bravado. Bravado invites challenge. Challenge requires someone to back down, and backing down is treated as weakness. This pattern is familiar, predictable, and often ugly. In such an atmosphere, a uniform can become a provocation. It can embolden a man who already feels entitled. It can intimidate those around him. It can encourage the belief that consequences are negotiable. Off-duty constables are not automatically dangerous. But off-duty constables who are drunk and used to obedience are a particular risk. They carry the state's authority like a private weapon, and they may use it that way. A brothel keeper understands this. She understands that what begins as a request can become a demand, and what begins as a demand can become force. She understands that refusal, in her line of work, is not simply refusal. It is a trigger. So she measures the night differently from the men outside her door. Where they see entertainment, she sees hazard. Where they see access, she sees boundary. Where they see authority, she sees a type of man whose authority may be the very thing that makes him most dangerous. This is not ideology. It is experience. Edmonton, on the eve of the shooting, was not expecting a crisis. The town had settled into its habits. The mounted police had settled into theirs. Vice had settled into its tolerated spaces. The machinery of daily life moved forward, creaking but working. That is always how these stories begin. Not with a sense of approaching catastrophe, but with routine. Then a routine breaks. A door is tested. A warning is ignored. And the entire arrangement that kept a town functional becomes suddenly visible, because it fails. Big Nelly Webb's house did not exist outside Edmonton's order. It existed inside it. That is the point. The brothel was part of the town's nightly management of male behaviour. It was part of the compromise that allowed respectability to pretend it was untroubled. It was part of the system's private infrastructure, even as it was publicly condemned. When the mounted police arrived at that door, they arrived not as outsiders entering enemy territory, but as participants in the town's hidden economy, whether they admitted it or not. The conflict that followed was not a collision between civilization and vice. It was a collision inside civilization's own hypocrisy. That is why the night matters historically. It shows what happens when the people tasked with enforcing the bargain forget that it is, in fact, a bargain, and begin behaving as though tolerated illegality means tolerated violation. There is a difference between tolerating a business and tolerating an assault. Edmonton had been willing to tolerate the first. It had trained certain men to believe the second would also be tolerated. On that night, it wasn't. By the time the footsteps reached the brothel, the town was already in motion. Not in panic. In the ordinary movement of after hours, drink, laughter, arguments, the low grind of bodies making choices they would not describe the next day. The men coming to the house were not, in their own minds, approaching a place where they might meet armed resistance. That is part of what made the event possible. They expected the door to open because doors like that were expected to open, for money, for uniform, for insistence. Expectation is a dangerous emotion. It turns desire into entitlement, and entitlement into rage when it is denied. The door stayed shut, and the town in that moment moved one step closer to losing control. Because once a door becomes a point of conflict, the night stops being routine. It becomes a test. And tests on the frontier rarely remain polite. Chapter 2: Big Nelly's House. A brothel is not a vague idea. It is a place. It has walls that must be paid for. It has locks that must hold. It has floors that must be scrubbed and beds that must be made and linen that must be replaced. It has mouths to feed. It has women to keep alive and men to keep out when their money is gone and their temper remains. If you want to understand why a madam might keep a firearm close, you begin here, with the daily mechanics of running a criminalized business in a town that depends on the business while refusing to protect it. Big Nelly Webb's house did not exist at the edge of Edmonton's life. It existed inside the town's nightly rhythm. It was one of the places where Edmonton put its contradictions. By day, respectable people could denounce houses of ill fame as moral infection. By night, men crossed thresholds and entered those houses as though the denunciation had never been spoken. The town's moral language and the town's behavior lived side by side without meeting. A madam lives where they meet. She is required to translate the town's private demand into a sustainable operation, while absorbing the costs of the town's public contempt. A madam's authority is always conditional. She holds power inside her rooms, but she holds it under threat. She has to maintain discipline without the protection of the law. She has to keep violence from becoming visible enough to invite raids. She has to keep customers satisfied without allowing customers to treat the house as a playground for cruelty. She has to keep other men, husbands, pimps, thieves, drunks, police, moral crusaders, from turning her business into an open invitation. The house itself is a machine designed to process risk. It processes men with money, men without money, men who arrive sober and men who arrive drunk, men who treat women as human beings and men who treat them as objects. It processes jealousy, shame, appetite, and bravado. It processes private violence in ways that must remain private, because the moment it becomes public the house becomes vulnerable. This is why brothels, in towns like Edmonton, often develop their own internal rules, boundaries that are not sentimental but necessary. Who gets in, who is refused, who is barred? What conduct is tolerated? What conduct ends with a man pushed back into the street? A madam's job is not only profit. It is containment. Containment is labor, and it is constant. The women in such a house are often described in records as though they are merely there, like furniture. They are not. They are workers living inside a criminalized economy. They are vulnerable to arrest, vulnerable to assault, vulnerable to theft, vulnerable to disease, vulnerable to the public's moral hatred and the customer's private contempt. A respectable woman can call for help and expect, at least in principle, to be taken seriously. A woman in a brothel cannot make that same assumption. She may call for help and be treated as the problem. She may call for help and be asked what she did to deserve it. She may call for help and find that the law arrives not to protect but to punish. This is why the madam matters. She is not simply a manager, she is often the only semi-stable authority available to women inside the house. She negotiates with police. She deals with landlords. She pays for repairs. She sets rules. She decides who stays and who goes. She absorbs the anger of customers so that a younger woman does not have to. This is not romantic. It is structural. A brothel survives by building a small alternative system inside a hostile larger one. Edmonton's larger system treated brothels as convenient and disposable. Convenient because they kept certain forms of male behaviour from erupting everywhere. Disposable because they could be used as moral targets whenever civic legitimacy needed to be demonstrated. A town could tolerate vice and still claim virtue by occasionally making an example of vice. Examples are cheaper than reform. So brothels lived under a rhythm of selective enforcement, tolerated long enough to become normal, raided when tolerance became politically inconvenient. This rhythm produces a particular kind of fear. Not the fear of law in the abstract, but the fear of law as a weapon that can be aimed or lowered depending on who needs to look righteous. A madam lives under that weapon. She becomes skilled in reading the town's moods, which officials are tightening, which are loosening, which churches are angry, which newspapers are sniffing around, which police are willing to be bought off with politeness or money, which are looking for a fight. The house becomes a radar station. It does not just sell sex. It reads the town. Big Nelly Webb was known enough to have a name that stuck. Nicknames are rarely kind. They are rarely neutral. They are a way a community marks someone as visible while keeping them at a distance. Big Nelly is a nickname that does several things at once. It makes her memorable. It makes her a character. It turns her into a figure people can talk about without granting her the dignity of ordinary identity. That is part of how vice is managed socially, by turning those who run it into public types. Madam, whore, fallen woman, dangerous woman, useful woman, laughable woman. Every label is a way of refusing to see the person. But the person still runs the house. Consider what it means to refuse entry. A brothel is often treated as a place of open access. That assumption is part of the cultural fantasy, that men, by virtue of being men, can enter. In reality, refusal is one of a madam's most important tools. She refuses men who are too drunk, too violent, too broke, too loud, too likely to cause trouble. She refuses men who bring the wrong kind of attention. Refusal is not only about safety. It is about survival. A madam who refuses too often loses customers. A madam who refuses too rarely loses her house. She must learn to refuse in a way that does not provoke. Provocation is what makes violence happen. This is where gender and power meet at the most practical level. A man who is refused can interpret refusal as humiliation. Humiliation, combined with drink and entitlement, can turn quickly into aggression. A madam understands that aggression is not always preventable. But she also understands that some men, especially men accustomed to obedience, are more dangerous when refused than ordinary customers. Men in uniform are such men. A uniform increases the chance that a refusal will not be accepted as final. The law treats brothels as criminal enterprises. The town treats them as civic utilities. Customers treat them as entertainment. Police can treat them as both, a site of enforcement and a site of private access. This is the risk that sits behind the door on the night of the shooting. If a police officer comes to the house as a customer, the interaction remains in the realm of vice. If he comes as an enforcer, it moves into the realm of law. If he comes off duty, drunk and expecting compliance, the interaction becomes something else entirely, a collision where the law's authority can be used as leverage for personal appetite. In that collision, the women inside the house are at their most vulnerable. They cannot safely appeal to the law because the law is at the door. They cannot trust the boundary between official power and private behavior because the person threatening them holds both in his body. This is why the door matters. A door is one of the few legal-like boundaries a madam can enforce. It is a physical line that says, "You are outside. We are inside. You do not enter unless we allow it." When the law itself tries to break that door, it communicates something that cannot be undone easily. Your boundaries do not count. Inside the house, there is also time. People imagine vice as constant motion, men arriving, women moving, transactions stacking. But a house like this also has quiet hours. There are moments between customers, moments of exhaustion, moments of irritated conversation, moments of waiting. There are nights when business is poor and nights when it is heavy and loud. There are women who want to leave and cannot. Women who want to stay and cannot. Women who are sick and must keep working because the town's moral contempt does not pay for rest. A madam has to manage these rhythms. She has to keep enough order inside that the house does not collapse into internal conflict. She has to manage jealousy among workers, anger from customers, theft, sickness, pregnancy, and fatigue. She has to keep the house from becoming a site where men can do anything they want simply because the women are criminalized. This is not an abstract moral point. It is a daily practical one. If the house becomes too dangerous, women leave. If women leave, the house fails. If the house fails, the madam loses everything. So the madam is always balancing. The public later will want to reduce the shooting to a simple story. A madam shot a Mountie. It is clean. It is dramatic. It contains the elements of moral theatre. But the shooting did not begin with the gun. It began with a set of expectations that accumulated across many nights. That men could take access. That drunkenness could be indulged. That law could be used informally. That women in brothels could be threatened without consequence. That a refusal from a criminalized woman did not have to be honored. This is how a town trains men to believe they can behave badly. Not through speeches or policy, but through the daily practice of letting certain behavior go unchallenged. Big Nelly's house, on the night of October 24, 1888, was not a stage awaiting drama. It was a business trying to survive. The women inside were not symbols, they were people managing their lives inside a hostile economy. The madam was not an abstract villain or heroine, she was a manager of risk. And that night, the risk arrived at the door wearing the authority of the state and the carelessness of drink. The door did what doors are supposed to do. It held, until it didn't. What follows, in the next chapter, is the moment when the town's private bargain with vice meets the force of men who believe the bargain applies only one way. A knock that is not a knock. A demand that is not negotiable. And a refusal that becomes, suddenly, the most dangerous word in the room. Chapter 3. The knock that wasn't a knock. There is a sound that belongs to ordinary visiting. A knock with patience in it. A pause between strikes. A rhythm that assumes the person inside has the right to decide whether to answer. What came to Big Nelly Webb's door that night was not that sound. It began, as these events often begin, with men who did not think of themselves as dangerous. Men who believed they were entitled to be entertained. Men who believed the town's rules bent around them. Men who were off duty, drunk, and wrapped in the quiet arrogance that comes from wearing a uniform in a place where the uniform is treated as truth. 2 constables of the Northwest Mounted Police, moving through Edmonton after dark, chose Nelly Webb's house. The choice itself was not the shock. The shock was what they brought with them, not only alcohol but expectation of access, expectation of compliance, expectation that the door was not really a boundary at all. In such a moment, the uniform becomes a private tool. It is no longer an emblem of public order, it is leverage. The men at the door did not need to announce themselves as law. The body already did. The town had trained itself to respond to that shape: stand aside, be polite, do not provoke. A brothel keeper cannot afford to respond that way automatically. She lives on the other side of the town's moral bargain. For her, the uniform does not reliably mean protection. It often means intrusion. It can mean arrest, harassment, humiliation, or simply the arrival of men who believe they can do what they like because their authority will cover it after. So the door stayed shut. That was the first refusal. And it was enough to change the atmosphere. Drunkenness changes how men interpret resistance. It strips away patience and replaces it with a kind of offended certainty: you are not meant to say no to me. The world inside a brothel is structured around this truth. Refusal is necessary, but it is also dangerous. It has to be managed like a live thing. A madam learns how to refuse without making the man feel small, because smallness is what triggers the need to reassert control. But some men are harder to refuse safely than others. A man who believes he has status is one kind of risk. A man who has status, and whose status is enforced by the state, is another. Even off-duty, even drunk, the constables carried a kind of social armor. They could cause trouble and still assume they would be treated as the injured party. They could break the rules and still assume the rules would fold around them. They could act like men with personal appetites and still insist later that everything they did fell under the shadow of authority. That is the privilege of uniform. And it is why a brothel door is sometimes tested not with a knock, but with force. At first, the encounter took the shape of a demand. Not a lawful demand, not a warrant-backed instruction, but the raw demand of men who expected obedience and were irritated by delay. The kind of demand that is common on a frontier after hours, too loud, too close, too certain. Nelly Webb's house had likely seen demands before. Saloons and brothels attract men who speak in demands. The difference here was not volume. It was the implication that the men outside believed they did not need to negotiate. Negotiation is the hidden structure of tolerated vice. A brothel exists under selective enforcement. That enforcement is softened in practice by informal arrangements, the understanding that vice will keep to its place, pay what it must, avoid becoming public embarrassment. In return, the town allows it to function. That is the bargain. A drunk constable kicking at the door is a violation of the bargain, not because he is entering vice, but because he is turning his authority into a private weapon. He is declaring that the bargain applies only to the women inside, never to the men outside. The door stayed shut. That was the second refusal. One can imagine the scene without inventing dialogue. The physical facts are enough. Two men in the late hours, impatient, intoxicated, standing close to a door they expect to open. The house quieting inside as the workers recognize danger. The madam measuring the situation, not romantic fear, but calculation. How drunk are they? How angry? How loud? Who else is in the street? How quickly could this become public? Because once a confrontation becomes public, a brothel loses every advantage. A confrontation in public does not give a madam protection. It gives her an audience. It gives the police a reason to arrive. It gives the town a moral excuse to punish her for the existence of her business, rather than to punish the men who caused the trouble. So the most rational choice, in many cases, is to keep everything contained. Containment begins with keeping the door closed. But the door can only contain if the men outside recognize it as legitimate. That night, they did not. Threats came. Threats are another kind of bargaining. They are negotiations stripped of civility. They attempt to force compliance through fear. In most social settings, threats are a marker of lawlessness. Here, they arrived dressed in the authority of law. This is the deeper violation, when the people tasked with preventing coercion become the coercers. Threats also change the calculation for the person inside. A madam can sometimes manage drunk men with words. But a man who threatens to break in is no longer a customer, he is an intruder. At that point, the question becomes less about business and more about survival. If he comes through the door, what will he do? If he comes through the door, can she stop him? If he comes through the door, will anyone believe her afterward? The last question is crucial. A respectable woman, attacked by a constable, might be believed because her status lends credibility. A madam is not given that credibility automatically. The criminalization of her work contaminates her claim to protection. Her testimony, later, will be received through the lens of her occupation. This is how criminalized spaces become spaces where violence is easier to commit. The door, then, is not merely a physical boundary. It is the last line of credibility. If the men enter, the story that follows may not favor the women inside. So the door stayed shut. That was the third refusal. Refusals accumulate. Each refusal increases the risk that the men outside will feel humiliated. Humiliation is one of the most common triggers for violence in male culture. It produces a need to reassert dominance. In a frontier town, that dominance is often reasserted through physical force. Now add the uniform. Add the fact that these men were used to compliance. Add alcohol. Add the setting, a brothel, where the women are criminalized and the men have been trained to believe their desires will be accommodated. The stage is set for the moment the town most fears, disorder that cannot be contained within tolerated vice. The men outside began to attack the boundary itself. The door was struck. Not tapped. Struck. Not asked. Tested. The sound of that kind of impact is different. It is not social. It is mechanical. It says, we are no longer in the realm of conversation, we are in the realm of force. From that moment, the outcome becomes less about personality and more about physics. How strong is the door? How strong are the men? How quickly does wood give way? How quickly does fear turn into action? This is why the phrase, the knock wasn't a knock, matters. It captures the transition from social world to violent world. One world has rules. The other has only limits. Wood is a limit. Inside, Nelly Webb had decisions to make quickly. A madam cannot wait for an intruder to enter before deciding how to respond. By then, response becomes reaction, and reaction is often too late. She had to decide what level of resistance was possible. She had to decide whether to call for help and risk bringing police who might blame her, or to handle it herself and risk being charged for defending an illegal house. This is one of the central contradictions of the case. Self-defense is a right. A brothel is criminalized. A criminalized woman defending a criminalized space is not treated neutrally. And yet, in that moment, neutrality is not a luxury. You defend yourself because you are alive and you intend to stay alive. A firearm in a brothel is not necessarily an aggressive tool. It is often a last resort equalizer. Women in such spaces are often physically outmatched. Men, especially drunk men, can overpower them easily. A gun changes the balance. A gun also changes the legal story afterward. A woman who shoots becomes a woman who must justify. A woman who does not shoot may become a woman who does not survive, or a woman who survives but cannot prove what happened inside an illegal house once men forced their way in. So she armed herself. Not for drama. For the same reason any vulnerable person arms themselves when the law at the door is behaving like an intruder. It is worth noticing what did not happen. There was no lawful raid with warrants. No measured procedure. No official command to open under legal authority. The men were off duty. Drunk. Acting from personal appetite and wounded pride. That matters because it strips away the one defense that might have protected them later, that they were simply doing their job. They were not. They were using their identity as police to behave as though they were above boundaries. That is what made the case combustible. It was not simply vice versus law. It was law's private misconduct colliding with vice's desperate need for a boundary. The door, battered and straining, became the place where Edmonton's hypocrisy condensed into a single object. A brothel keeper, criminalized, tolerated, useful, despised, insisting on a boundary. Two constables, agents of order, refusing to accept that boundary. This is the moment the town begins to lose control. Not because a gun will be fired, though it will, but because the town's private bargain, tolerated illegality managed quietly, cannot survive a scene like this. A bargain depends on mutual restraint. The men at the door had none. When the wood finally began to give way, the situation crossed its final threshold. From that point, nothing that happened next could be unmade by apology. The door's damage was evidence. The noise was public enough to spill. The use of force by men in uniform could no longer be concealed as rumor. It was becoming an event. Nelly Webb warned them she was armed. The warning matters. It is the last moment where the violence could have been prevented by choice. A warning is a final offer of restraint. Stop now, and this can still end without blood. The warning was not accepted. The door continued to break. And with each crack of wood, Edmonton's story of itself, orderly, governed, respectable, cracked too. Chapter 4. The door gives way. A door is a simple invention, but on the frontier it carries more than its share of meaning. It tells the world in plain timber that something inside has been claimed, by a household, by a business, by a woman who intends, at least within those walls, to decide what happens next. In a town where men often moved as though everything was available to them, a closed door is a quiet act of defiance. That is why the door became the battleground. Because what was being tested that night was not only the physical strength of a frame. It was whether a criminalized woman was permitted to have a boundary at all. When the door began to fail, the event stopped being a dispute. It became an invasion. Forced entry is not a metaphor. It is a sequence. It begins with sound, the heavier strikes, the splintering, the vibration that runs through the wood into the room's air. It changes the internal atmosphere immediately. It forces the people inside to stop thinking in social terms and start thinking in bodily ones. Where do we stand? Where do we move? What objects become weapons? How quickly can we flee? A brothel is not designed for safety. It is designed for access. That is its business. Its rooms are meant to be entered. That design becomes a weakness the moment entry is no longer consensual. The madam knows this. She knows the house's vulnerabilities better than any customer, because she is the one who has repaired doors, paid for broken things, dealt with drunk men who did not want to leave. She knows where a man will push, where a lock will give, where a frame will crack. This knowledge is not abstract. It is born of repetition. So when the door began to give way, Nelly Webb would not have experienced surprise in the way a sheltered person might. She would have experienced recognition. This is the moment it becomes dangerous. Recognition brings speed. Inside the house, everything that had been business became, suddenly, survival. It is difficult for later readers to grasp how isolating that moment can be, because we are trained to imagine the law as something you can call. But the law was on the other side of the door. Not the idealized law of procedure and restraint, the law as symbol, but the law as two bodies, drunk and angry, using their status as permission. Who do you call when the people breaking in are the people you are supposed to call? This is where criminalized women are most alone. A respectable household faced with an intruder can appeal to neighbors, to police, to community standards. A brothel cannot reliably do that. Neighbors may not intervene. Police may arrive and punish the house rather than the intruder. The women inside may be treated as lesser victims because the public assumes they invited violence by existing. This assumption is one of the deepest violences of moral regulation. It treats certain women as inherently violable. In such a context, self-defense is not only a right. It is often the only available mechanism of protection. The men outside did not behave as though they were entering a space with equal rules. They behaved as though the door was an inconvenience, something that should yield because they wished it to. The uniform encourages this belief. It teaches a man that boundaries will move when he pushes. It teaches him that resistance is abnormal. It teaches him that the refusal of a woman, especially in a criminalized space, is a problem to be corrected. So they pushed harder. The lock strained. Wood fractured. The frame began to splinter around its stressed points. The sound of breaking timber is not subtle. It is a sound that announces itself to the street, to other rooms, to anyone within hearing distance. It is a sound that turns a private conflict into a public event. This is one of the reasons the assault on the door is historically important. It makes the incident difficult to contain afterward. It cannot easily be dismissed as a misunderstanding or a rumor. Doors do not break themselves. A broken door is evidence. And evidence is what towns fear when they have been living on unofficial arrangements. At some point in the sequence, the physical failure becomes visible. A crack opens where there was none. The panel shifts. The edge of the door no longer sits flush. The lock no longer feels like an anchor. It feels like a delay. The intruder learns, in his hands, that the boundary will not hold much longer. That knowledge can inflame him. It can turn anger into triumph. Inside, the women learn something too, that they will soon be sharing space with men who have already decided they are entitled to enter by force. Once they enter, the encounter cannot return to negotiation. The intruders have already crossed the moral line. They have already committed themselves to domination. This is why forced entry escalates so quickly. It is not only physical, it is psychological. It hardens the attacker. It corner traps the defender. When a person is corner trapped, they begin to think in absolutes. Stop him now, or be at his mercy later. Nelly Webb armed herself. It is easy for later moral voices to cluck at a woman having a revolver. It is easy to imagine that a gun in a brothel is inherently criminal. But the law did not offer women in such spaces reliable protection. A madam lived with continual threat, not only from customers but from thieves, from violent men, from retaliation, from other operators, and from police who could behave badly with little fear of consequence. A gun changes a woman's bargaining position. It tells a man that force will be met with force. It also imposes responsibility. If she fires, the state will demand explanation. It will treat her action as a legal event, not a survival act. The woman will become a defendant. The intruder will become a victim. The town will become invested in which narrative survives. That is the trap. The woman can protect herself in the moment, but she may be punished for doing so afterward. Still, the gun is often chosen. because the moment is immediate and the afterward is uncertain. A woman facing forced entry does not get to prioritize future reputation over present safety. There are moments in an escalation where one party offers the other a final chance to stop. A warning is not weakness. It is an attempt to keep the violence from becoming irreversible. It is also a legal marker. It signals, you were told, you continued anyway. Nelly Webb warned them she was armed. The warning matters because it shows she was not hunting for an excuse to shoot. She was trying to prevent the necessity of shooting. The warning offered the men a way to retreat without humiliation. They could claim drunken error, back away, and the incident might remain an ugly story rather than a legal case. But retreat is hard for men who have already committed to the performance of force. To retreat is to accept that the door has authority. To retreat is to accept that the woman inside has a boundary. To retreat is to admit that their own authority is not absolute. Drunkenness makes retreat even harder. Alcohol turns backing down into an unbearable wound. So they continued. And the door continued to fail. When the barrier finally weakened enough, the intruder's body began to enter the space. It did not arrive as a person stepping politely into a room. It arrived as a limb, a boot, a leg forcing itself through the gap created by broken wood. This detail is crucial not because it is vivid but because it is specific. It captures the exact nature of the threat. The men were not being refused entry to a public establishment. They were physically breaking into a private room. A leg thrust through a broken door is a declaration. I am coming in whether you want it or not. At that point, the defender's options narrow to almost nothing. If she does nothing, the men enter, and whatever happens next will happen inside a criminalized space where her credibility is compromised. If she fights with her hands, she will likely be overpowered. If she tries to flee, she risks pursuit, capture, assault, and being blamed for the chaos that follows. The firearm becomes the only tool capable of stopping the intrusion at the threshold. This is the grim practicality of the moment. A door gives way. A body enters. A woman decides whether to allow it. The shot itself is often described as though it arrived out of nowhere. It did not. It arrived at the end of a chain of actions. Drunken constables approaching in expectation. Refusal at the door. Threats. Repeated strikes. Forced entry. Warning. Continued force. A limb through the broken frame. The gunshot is not the beginning of violence. It is the defender's attempt to end the intruder's violence before it becomes something worse. This is one of the ways the law often misreads self-defense in criminalized spaces. It treats the gun as the primary violence and the forced entry as background. But in the lived reality of a woman in that house, the forced entry was the first violence. The gun was the response. The difference matters, because the entire trial will turn on which act is treated as central. When Nelly Webb fired, she did not only wound a man. She shattered a social arrangement. Because Edmonton had been relying on the quiet belief that vice could be tolerated and managed. That belief required that the police remain, in public imagination, above the vice they privately interacted with. It required that women in brothels remain compliant and vulnerable, absorbing intrusion without resisting in ways that became public. A madam shooting a Mountie makes everything visible. That Mounties could behave like drunk intruders. That brothel doors could be broken by men in uniform. That vice houses were not merely moral problems but sites of real danger. That women in criminalized spaces could claim the right to defend themselves. That visibility is what the town could not easily bear. In the seconds after the shot, a new set of calculations began. Not only inside the brothel, but in the wider system. How will the police respond? How will the town respond? How will authority explain itself? Who will be blamed? The door had already given way. The event had already happened. Now the town had to contain meaning. Chapter 5. The Shot. A gunshot has a peculiar power in a frontier town. It compresses time. It pulls private conduct into public space. It declares, without needing witnesses or explanation, that something has crossed a line. On the night of October 24, 1888, the line was crossed at a doorway. The shot was not a flourish. It was not theatrical. It was the brief, brutal punctuation at the end of a forced entry. A .38 revolver fired into the space where a man's body was pushing through broken wood, an intrusion turning into presence turning into threat. The bullet struck Constable Thomas Kearney, the off-duty Mountie who had been forcing his way in. He did not die, but he was badly wounded. The injury would follow him for the rest of his life. That fact matters. It changes the shape of the case. A dead officer would have demanded a different kind of institutional response, more severe, less flexible, harder to manage without appearing weak. A surviving officer made the story more complicated. It left room for argument. It left room for narrative. It left room for the system to maneuver. In that narrow space between death and survival, the town's future conduct became negotiable. And negotiation is what Edmonton was best at. Immediately after a shot, there is always a moment of stunned stillness. Not calm, not peace, just the tiny pause where bodies register what has happened. The sound of a revolver indoors is sharp and shocking. It is not like the crack of a fire outdoors. It fills the room and the hallway and the street. It is heard by people who were not part of the struggle, and that hearing makes them part of it anyway. Inside the house, the women would have moved fast. A madam does not have the luxury of lingering in shock. A gunshot in a brothel does not end danger, it changes it. It can stop entry, but it can also provoke retaliation. It can draw more men. It can summon the police, on duty now, not off duty, and the police may arrive with the assumption that the brothel is at fault simply because it exists. So the immediate concern is not only the wounded man. It is the next 5 minutes. Who else is outside? Will they try to break in again? Will more shots be fired? Will someone call for help? Will the women inside be dragged into the street? A brothel is a place where harm is expected to remain private. Once a gunshot makes harm public, everyone becomes exposed. Outside, Kearney's body would have become the center of the street. A wounded man in uniform changes the behavior of those around him. Even drunk men sobering rapidly will respond to uniform as though it is a signal flare. People gather. People stare. People shout for help. Someone runs. Someone swears. Someone tries to lift the injured man and discovers the awful weight of a body that cannot move the way it should. And in the middle of this, Edmonton's moral machinery starts turning. Because now it is not simply a drunken intrusion into a brothel. Now it is a woman in an illegal house who has shot a Mountie. That phrasing is the seed of the scandal. The simple act of describing the event begins the battle over meaning. Language is never neutral here. What you call the incident determines what response becomes acceptable. Is it self-defense? Is it assault? Is it attempted murder? Is it an attack on law and order? Is it a predictable outcome of police misconduct? Edmonton will not agree on the answer. It will fracture quickly, and those fractures will reveal where power sits. For the mounted police, a wounded constable is not only a medical problem. It is a legitimacy problem. The NWMP were meant to embody restraint. Their image was tied to discipline and authority. A story in which 2 drunk off-duty constables attempted to force entry into a brothel and one was shot by the madam is a story that makes the institution look foolish at best, predatory at worst. Either way, it is unacceptable. So the institution's first instinct is to restore control over narrative. Control begins with procedure: take statements, secure the scene, decide who is arrested, decide what is charged, decide what is said publicly. This is how institutions handle embarrassment. They wrap it in paperwork and try to make the paperwork feel like truth. But paperwork cannot erase the sound of a gunshot. It cannot erase a broken door. It cannot erase the fact that the first violence was forced entry by men in uniform. Those facts resist containment. Kearney's survival added another complication: he could speak. A dead man is a symbol. A living man is a witness. A witness can reshape the story, or be reshaped by it. He can claim one version and later adjust it as pressure mounts. He can be coached. He can be encouraged to remember selectively. He can be persuaded that certain details are better left vague. This is not always malicious. It is often instinctive. People align their accounts with the story that protects them and the institution they belong to. A wounded officer also attracts sympathy. Sympathy can be used to blunt criticism. It can be used to shift attention away from misconduct and toward injury. The town can be told, "Look what she did to him." It is a powerful move, because it converts the police into victim and the madam into aggressor, regardless of what happened first. This is why the wounded body becomes a contested object. It is not just a person suffering. It is evidence in the war over narrative. In the hours after the shooting, decisions would have been made quickly. Was Nelly Webb arrested immediately? Was she treated as dangerous? Was she treated as a civic inconvenience? Was she held as an example? Was she protected from mob impulse, or exposed to it? Frontier towns can turn fast when a story takes hold. Moral outrage can become a kind of social appetite, the desire to punish the woman who broke the rules too openly. A madam who shoots a Mountie can become, in some minds, the embodiment of everything wrong with vice. But outrage has to contend with other realities. Many men in the town would have known privately that Mounties visited brothels. Many would have suspected that the constables behaved badly. Many would have seen the broken door and understood immediately what it meant. Some would have quietly believed that Nelly Webb had done what anyone would do if men forced entry and refused to stop. So outrage would not have been unanimous. It would have split. This split is one of the case's most important features. It shows that the town's moral economy was not simple. People could condemn vice and still recognize abuse of power. They could despise brothels and still resent drunk constables behaving like intruders. This is how legitimacy is contested, not through ideology, but through competing practical loyalties. The physical details of the shooting mattered because they pinned the incident to a specific shape. A man forcing entry. A warning given. A limb through the door. A shot fired at the threshold. This is not the shape of a hunting ambush. It is the shape of a defensive act. Threshold shootings carry a particular meaning. The defender does not chase. She does not pursue. She does not fire into the street from behind safety. She fires at the moment a boundary is breached. That matters legally. It also matters morally. It frames the act as a last resort. But the prosecution will later want to flatten this. It will want to make the act appear aggressive, because aggressive acts justify harsh punishment and restore institutional authority. So the early hours after the shooting become crucial. They are when the first stories are told, and first stories have a stubborn life. If the first story is Madam shoots Mountie, the town swings one way. If the first story is drunk Mountie breaks into brothel and gets shot, the town swings another. The battle for the first story is one of the most important battles in any scandal. There is a further irony here, one that Edmonton could not comfortably face. The shooting was, in a sense, a predictable outcome of the town's bargain. The town tolerated brothels because they contained male disorder. The town tolerated a certain amount of police intimacy with vice because it kept things manageable. The town tolerated selective enforcement because it allowed respectability to coexist with private demand. But toleration breeds entitlement. Entitlement breeds intrusion. Intrusion breeds resistance. Resistance produces violence. A door holds for a time, then it breaks. The gunshot was not an alien eruption into an otherwise orderly system. It was the system's contradiction becoming physical. And once it became physical, it could not be denied. The immediate aftermath did not end the night's instability. It multiplied it. A wounded constable had to be treated. Reports had to be made. Nelly Webb had to be secured, either arrested or protected, depending on how the system chose to frame her. The house itself became a problem, a crime scene, a vice scene, and a symbol of civic hypocrisy all at once. And then there was the public. By morning, Edmonton would be talking. By noon, it would be laughing in some corners and outraged in others. By evening, the story would begin to harden into positions, and those positions would determine what kind of justice was possible. Because this was never going to be a simple question of guilt. It was going to be a question of what the town could afford to admit. That its police could behave like intruders. That its tolerated vice was not contained in any meaningful way. That a criminalized woman might still have a right to defend herself. And that the boundary between order and disorder had been maintained largely by silence. The shot destroyed the silence. Chapter 6. The town reacts. By morning, Edmonton did what towns do when a private arrangement becomes public. It talked. It talked in kitchens and doorways, in the backs of shops, at the edge of the street where men could pretend they were only passing. It talked in saloons that still smelled of last night's drink and in respectable rooms where the very act of discussing a brothel required a careful tone, outrage on the surface, curiosity underneath. A woman had shot a Mountie. That was the headline version. the version that could be spoken without admitting too much about why the Mountie had been there, or what he had been trying to do, or what kind of behavior the town had tolerated until the moment it could no longer pretend it was tolerable. But Edmonton's talk did not stay simple. It never does. Because everyone understood, in their bones, that the gunshot had not come from nowhere. It had come from a door being broken by men who expected it to open. And once that detail was known, the town's response split into the shape of its own hypocrisy. Outrage, laughter, and the need to choose a story. A scandal forces people to choose what kind of town they believe they live in. If Edmonton was a town of firm order, then the shooting had to be framed as an attack on authority, an insolent criminal woman striking the state. That framing demanded punishment. It demanded a show of strength. It demanded that the law be seen restoring itself. If Edmonton was a town of practical arrangements, then the shooting had to be framed as what happens when men in uniform behave like drunk intruders. That framing did not erase the illegality of the brothel, but it made the brothel almost irrelevant to the central moral fact. A door was forced, a warning was ignored, and a woman defended her threshold. Those two framings could not coexist comfortably. The town could not condemn police misconduct without weakening the symbol of police authority. It could not condemn the madam without risking the obvious question, why did it take a gunshot for anyone to take her boundaries seriously? So people did what people do when truth threatens their comfort. They chose the story that protected their loyalties. Some men, especially those invested in the mounted police as a civic symbol, leaned hard toward outrage. Not only because a constable had been shot, but because the shot embarrassed the uniform. Embarrassment is often mislabeled as moral fury. It feels cleaner. Others leaned toward a different emotion, humor. The frontier has always had a brutal sense of comedy when authority slips. A Mountie, drunk forcing entry, shot by a madam, was a story that could be told with a smirk, and smirking was a way of deflating the seriousness of the misconduct without having to confront it. Humor is a pressure valve. It releases tension without changing conditions. Then there were those who felt something closer to fear that this would become a wider conflict, fear that women in vice houses might arm themselves generally, fear that the town's after-dark arrangements could now erupt into open violence. Fear is what pushes institutions to act quickly. Not because they love justice, but because they hate uncertainty. The police response, restoring control before restoring truth. The first institutional instinct after a scandal is not moral clarity. It is containment. Containment means taking charge of the scene, establishing a narrative, and preventing a story from escalating beyond what the institution can manage. It is the administrative version of putting your hand over a flame before the fire spreads. The mounted police faced a particular hazard. The hazard was not only that a constable had been shot. The hazard was the manner of it, off-duty, drunk, forcing entry into a brothel. If the public discussion became too detailed, if the broken door and the drunkenness and the threats became the center, then the NWMP risked being seen not as guardians of order but as another source of disorder. And the NWMP could not afford that in a town where their authority was part of the town's idea of itself. So the response would naturally lean toward minimizing the constable's behavior and maximizing the drama of the madam's shot. There is nothing mystical about this. It is institutional self-preservation. What matters is how quickly self-preservation can become the substitute for truth. In practical terms, this meant decisions about how Webb was handled and where she was held, how Kearney's injury was described, which witnesses were encouraged to speak, which details were treated as incidental, and how publicly the brothel's door damage was acknowledged. A broken door is inconvenient evidence. It refuses to be rhetorical. It sits there, splintered, and tells its own story. Institutions prefer evidence they can explain. Webb becomes two things at once, defendant and problem. The legal system needed Webb as a defendant. The town needed her as a problem to be removed from immediate visibility. This distinction matters. A defendant can be processed, charged, held, tried, sentenced, or acquitted. A problem is managed differently. A problem is moved out of sight, dealt with quietly, spoken about carefully, and used as an example if necessary. Webb's existence as a known madam complicated everything. She was not a stranger. She was already woven into the town's private knowledge. Many men who might sit on juries or speak with authority could not honestly claim ignorance of her trade. Some might have visited similar places. Some might have had friends who did. This is how tolerated vice infects the integrity of public judgment. It creates a web of silent implication. So the town's response to Webb would inevitably contain a thread of irritation. Not simply at her act, but at her visibility. She had forced the town to look at itself. Towns dislike mirrors. To control that irritation, institutions often try to isolate the offender as an anomaly, a particularly dangerous woman, a particularly reckless house, a particularly bad figure. This allows the town to avoid recognizing that the event was produced by routine conditions. It is never the system. It is always that woman. The humiliation spiral, when the Mounties become the joke. The most destabilizing ingredient in the aftermath was not rage. It was ridicule. Ridicule destroys authority faster than accusation, because accusation can be met with defense. Ridicule spreads like laughter. It turns an institution into a subject for jokes, and jokes are a form of social permission. Once people feel permitted to laugh at authority, they feel less obligated to obey it. Edmonton's aftermath reportedly featured precisely the kind of ridicule the NWMP feared. Mounties assigned to guard Webb's house found drunk, their equipment stolen, their authority treated like a costume to be worn and mocked. This is a spectacular collapse of the frontier myth. The mounted police, imagined as disciplined, are revealed as bodies, drinking, sleeping, failing. In a different context, a community might have responded with stern condemnation. Edmonton's response, part condemnation, part laughter, shows how thin the line was between official authority and public skepticism. And it reveals something even more dangerous for the institution. The public already suspected that police were entangled with vice. The incident did not create suspicion, it confirmed it loudly. This is why scandals about policing and prostitution are so volatile. They do not simply expose misconduct. They expose the lie that the system is separate from the underworld. Respectable Edmonton's panic, the fear of being seen. Once a scandal breaks, respectable people do not only worry about crime. They worry about being associated with it. A brothel scandal threatens to drag half the town into uncomfortable visibility. It raises the possibility that names might be spoken, that patronage might be hinted at, that men who attend church by day might be recognized at night. So a second wave of containment begins, not from police, but from the town itself. People who are not officials begin pressuring for an ending that restores silence. This pressure does not necessarily mean they want Webb punished harshly. Some might. Others might simply want the whole matter to disappear. Either way, the goal is the same, to shut down the public dissection of the town's private life. This is the quiet reason that vice cases are often handled with strange unevenness. Sometimes a town makes an example. Sometimes it lets the matter drift toward a resolution that involves as little public airing as possible. The problem with Webb's case was that the matter had already become too vivid to drift easily. A Mountie had been shot. A door had been broken. The story had a spine. You could repeat it. You could argue about it. You could laugh about it. That is what towns cannot control once it begins, the public's appetite. Competing sympathies, who deserves protection. A scandal also forces the public to confront who they believe deserves protection. The uniformed man, even if drunk, carries instinctive public sympathy. He is one of ours. He represents order. People are trained to protect him symbolically. The madam, even if defending herself, carries instinctive public contempt. She represents a trade the town condemns. People are trained to treat her as less worthy of sympathy. The door complicates this training. A broken door and a forced entry are hard to moralize away. They tap into something deeper than respectability, the idea that a person has a right not to be invaded. When the invader is a constable, the moral confusion intensifies. So sympathies began to clash. Some people insisted the uniform should decide the matter. If a Mountie is shot, the shooter must pay. Others insisted the threshold should decide the matter. If a door is forced and warning ignored, the defender is not the villain. This clash did not stay philosophical. It seeped into the practical world, how Webb was spoken of, how witnesses were treated, how the town framed its own identity. It determined whether Edmonton would treat the case as a scandal about vice or a scandal about policing. And that, in turn, determined what kind of justice was possible. The town's real fear, that the bargain had been exposed as fragile. Edmonton had been living on a bargain it preferred not to name. The bargain said, we will tolerate certain illegal spaces as long as they remain contained, useful and quiet. The bargain also implied something it rarely admitted, that the law itself was not neutral. It was applied in ways that served the town's stability, not its moral consistency. Selective enforcement is a form of governance. It works, until it produces a moment that cannot be contained. The shooting was that moment. Because it revealed that the bargain depended on women in vice houses remaining compliant even when men in uniform behaved badly. It depended on the women absorbing intrusion without resisting in ways that became visible. Once Webb fired, she broke the expected pattern. The town now faced a choice: tighten enforcement and risk exposing how long it had tolerated vice, or soften and contain, accepting that some truths would remain unspoken. Most towns choose containment, because containment keeps the social machine running. Edmonton began to choose it quickly. The aftermath hardens into a case. Within days, the incident ceased being a night's chaos and became a file: statements, reports, medical descriptions, charges. This transformation is not neutral. When an event becomes a case file, the system selects which parts are important. It elevates some facts and relegates others. It turns messy lived experience into categories: offender, victim, witness, scene. And the system, inevitably, tries to simplify. It wants a clean villain. It wants a clean motive. It wants a clean legal question. But this case resisted cleanliness. It contained too many contradictions. A criminalized woman acting defensively. A lawman acting lawlessly. A tolerated illegal business becoming the scene of public violence. A town that needed vice but needed to deny it. These contradictions could not be eliminated, only managed. The management would happen in court, where the event would be translated into legal language: self-defense, intent, credibility, propriety. But long before court, the town had already begun shaping what it wanted the case to mean. And what it wanted, above all, was control. Control of the story. Control of the uniform's reputation. Control of the visibility of vice. Control of the lesson the public would be allowed to take. Edmonton's reaction in those first days was therefore not merely gossip. It was social sorting, deciding where blame could safely land without collapsing the town's self-image. The next pressure point was inevitable. Once the story was public, once the mounted police had been laughed at, once Webb had become a symbol, the institution had to answer the only question that truly matters in a scandal. Not what happened. Everyone already knew what happened. The question was, who will be made to carry it? Chapter 7, The Mounties as the Story. In the first hours after the shot, it was easy to imagine that Edmonton's scandal would be contained to a familiar moral frame. A brothel. A madam. A gun. A wounded man in uniform. That frame is comfortable because it keeps the center of gravity where respectable society prefers it, in the criminalized space, with the criminalized woman. It allows the public to feel certainty. It allows the mounted police to remain, at least in principle, above the mess. But the case did not stay in that frame. Because the Mounties would not allow it to. Not intentionally, not as an act of rebellion against their own image, but through the oldest and most destructive kind of institutional weakness: ordinary human misconduct occurring beneath a powerful symbol. The wounded constable was only the beginning. What followed, drunkenness, incompetence, and public humiliation, shifted the focus away from the brothel and onto the police themselves. The shooting became an event that exposed the system's own body, its habits, its vulnerabilities, and the gap between its myth and its reality. By the time Edmonton was finished talking, many people were no longer asking whether a madam had broken the law. They were asking whether the law had broken itself. The institution's problem, legitimacy, is fragile. The Northwest Mounted Police were not merely local law enforcement. They were the embodiment of a larger promise: that the frontier could be governed, that colonial authority could be extended, that discipline could hold. This promise mattered intensely in a territorial setting where legitimacy was still being constructed. A young town leans heavily on symbols. A uniform becomes an anchor. A badge becomes proof. That is why the NWMP could not treat the scandal as a small local embarrassment. It threatened to stain the uniform itself. And a stained uniform does not only reduce respect, it reduces compliance. Once people believe the police are drunk, predatory, or incompetent, they begin to hedge. They begin to resist quietly. They begin to treat enforcement as negotiable. They begin to think of the state as another local power group rather than as a neutral guardian. In a frontier town, that shift is dangerous. So the institution's first objective was not justice. It was restoration of legitimacy. How institutions restore legitimacy? By controlling blame. Institutions protect themselves by isolating misconduct. They treat it as the fault of individuals rather than as a symptom of culture. This is how they keep the symbol clean. The problem was not the police, it was those two men. The uniform remains sacred, only the wearer is corrupt. This maneuver is common and often effective. It satisfies the public's desire for explanation without requiring institutional reform. But it depends on the misconduct being containable. In Edmonton, the misconduct was not containable because it continued. The story did not end at the door. It evolved into a second scandal, the scandal of the Mountie's behaviour after the shooting, when their attempts to manage the situation produced new embarrassment. And nothing destabilizes legitimacy faster than repeated embarrassment. The humiliation of the guards. One of the most corrosive details in the Webb case is what happened next. The constables assigned to guard the house were found drunk, their equipment stolen, their authority paraded around town. This is a disaster on several levels. First, it confirms the public suspicion that drunkenness was not an isolated flaw. It suggests a culture of drinking strong enough to incapacitate men on duty, men supposedly representing discipline. Second, it collapses the idea that the police can control even their own bodies, let alone the town's vice. A drunken guard is not a guardian. He is a liability. Third, it turns the police into an object of public play. Theft of police gear is not just theft, it is symbolic inversion. It takes the instruments of authority and turns them into props. This is how a town laughs at the state. And the state cannot afford laughter. In the wake of that incident, the case shifted. The brothel was no longer the only morally contaminated space. The police were now contaminated too. When the guardians become ridiculous, the moral frame collapses. The danger of ridicule. Outrage can be channeled. It can be directed into calls for punishment. It can be satisfied by sentencing. Outrage allows the system to perform strength. Ridicule cannot be sentenced away. Ridicule spreads through repetition. It becomes story. It becomes a joke that survives, because it tells the truth people already suspected, that authority is often less solid than it pretends. That is why police scandals that involve drunkenness are so destructive. Drunkenness is not complex. It does not require political argument. Everyone understands it. Everyone recognizes it. Everyone knows how it looks. A drunk officer is an image that does not require interpretation. It undermines legitimacy by simply existing. So when Edmonton laughed at the Mounties, it did something more radical than criticize them. It stripped the uniform of its magic. The tightrope, condemning misconduct without weakening authority. This is the institutional bind. If the NWMP punished the misbehaving constables too harshly, they might be forced to admit how serious the misconduct was. That admission would make the institution look structurally compromised. If they punished them too softly, the public would assume the institution protected its own, and the stain would deepen. If they blamed Webb too strongly, they risked drawing attention back to the forced entry, the broken door, and the fact that a woman in a criminalized space had reason to fear police conduct. If they blamed her too softly, they risked appearing weak toward violence against their own. Every path carried risk. This is why institutional responses in such cases often look inconsistent or strange. They are not guided by moral clarity. They are guided by damage control. And damage control often produces the very thing it is trying to avoid: further scrutiny. The brothel as a mirror for policing culture. The Webb case forces a difficult truth to the surface. Brothels were not separate from the police world. They were entangled with it. In towns like Edmonton, police are often present in vice spaces in multiple roles. As enforcers. As customers. As protectors in exchange for informal compliance. As men who treat their authority as a private tool. Even when the institution tries to insist otherwise, the lived reality is that policing culture does not stop at the end of a shift. Off-duty, an officer is still treated with deference. Off-duty, he still carries the social power of his badge. Off-duty, he may feel entitled to access spaces ordinary men cannot enter safely. A brothel becomes a place where that entitlement is tested. If a madam refuses entry to a drunk constable, she is not merely refusing a man. She is refusing a man whose identity has been built around being obeyed. That refusal becomes unbearable. So he escalates. This is not simply about bad apples. It is about the psychology of authority in a setting where vice is tolerated and women are criminalized. Those conditions produce predictable abuses. The Webb case is notable because the abuse met resistance loud enough to become public. The system's instinct: change the subject. Once the Mounties became the story, the institution needed to redirect attention. This is another classic move in scandal management: return the focus to the proper offender, the proper illegal space, the proper moral target. In practice, this meant emphasizing the illegality of the brothel, Webb's status as a madam, the idea that she was inherently dangerous, the sanctity of the uniform, the injury to the officer. The more attention could be pulled toward Webb's criminality, the less attention would rest on the police's behavior. This is not always accomplished through explicit lies. It can be done through emphasis, repeating some facts and muting others until the public remembers what the institution needs remembered. But the Webb case resisted this redirection because too many people had heard the door. Too many people understood the basic sequence. Too many people were already amused by the police's humiliation. The story could not be reset easily. So the institution turned toward its last reliable refuge, the courtroom. Why the trial becomes the containment chamber. A courtroom is, among other things, a narrative machine. It forces events into categories: victim, defendant, intent, justification. It restricts what can be said. It limits which truths can be spoken in which forms. It insists on procedure. For an institution facing scandal, court is useful because it moves the conversation from taverns and streets into formal language. It removes the public from the scene and replaces it with rules. If the trial can be framed as "Did Webb unlawfully shoot a constable?" then the misconduct leading up to the shooting can be described as incidental rather than central. If the trial can be framed as "Crime in a brothel," then the forced entry can be treated as part of a messy vice world rather than as an officer's violation of a citizen's boundary. Court does not erase scandal, but it can reduce its shape. It can make something complicated feel legally narrow. That narrowing is a form of containment. And containment was what the NWMP needed. The crisis beneath the crisis. Beneath the loud story of a shooting sat a quieter institutional crisis. If Edmonton accepted that Webb's shot was justified self-defense, then it would have to accept that Mounties could behave like intruders, and that a woman in an illegal business might still possess a right the town had been denying her informally, the right to be left alone behind her own door. That acceptance would not only affect Webb. It would affect how people interpreted future police conduct, future raids, future vice enforcement. It would weaken the unspoken assumption that police access to vice spaces was natural and unquestioned. So the trial would not simply decide whether Webb was guilty. It would decide whether the town's bargain could continue. Could vice remain tolerated if police could not use it as a playground? Could police remain legitimate if their authority was shown to be negotiable at a doorway? Could respectable Edmonton continue pretending it was above the very underworld it relied on? This is why the Mounties became the story, because their conduct revealed that the town's order depended on them behaving well enough not to expose its contradictions. They did not. And now the town had to decide what it would do with the exposure. Chapter 8: Cleanup Work. By the time the town settled into its morning routines, the shooting had already stopped being an incident and started becoming a liability. Liability is the word that sits beneath every official action in the first days after a scandal. It is not a moral term. It is a practical one. It asks, what does this event threaten, and how quickly can that threat be neutralized? The Webb shooting threatened several things at once. The mounted police's legitimacy. Edmonton's carefully managed tolerance of vice. The illusion that law was applied cleanly. The town's ability to keep its private habits private. And the basic claim that the frontier could be governed through discipline rather than through bargains. So cleanup began. Cleanup does not mean cleansing sin. It means managing meaning. It means deciding which facts will be made central and which will be treated as background noise. It means narrowing the event until it fits inside a story the system can live with. The system's problem was that the event was too vivid to be reduced easily. Broken wood and a wounded constable do not lend themselves to quiet forgetting. Yet forgetting was, in many ways, the only outcome the town truly wanted. So the town tried something it was very good at: procedural containment. Procedure as a form of control. The first move in any institutional cleanup is paperwork. Statements are taken, names recorded, timelines proposed, medical descriptions written, rumors sorted into relevant and irrelevant. A chaotic event is pulled into the stiff shape of an official narrative. This process is often treated as neutral truth-making, but it is also a power act. Whoever gathers statements first often shapes what later becomes the story. Whoever decides what gets written down decides what survives. In a case like this, the following questions mattered immediately. Who was allowed to speak, and in what tone? Were the women inside the house treated as credible witnesses or as suspect mouths? How prominently was the forced entry recorded? How prominently was drunkenness recorded? Was Kearney described first as a Mountie, or first as a drunk man breaking in? Was Webb described first as a madam, or first as a woman defending her door? These seem like small choices. They are not. They determine which moral frame dominates. An institution under threat chooses frames that protect itself, containing the Mounties without destroying the uniform. The mounted police were stuck with a problem they could not erase. Off-duty constables had behaved badly. The goal, then, was to isolate the behavior to the men while shielding the institution. The classic formula goes like this. Emphasize the men's drunkenness as personal weakness. Emphasize the injured constable's suffering as proof of cost. Emphasize the need for orderly trial rather than public argument. Avoid language that suggests systemic misconduct. Treat the brothel's illegality as the moral center whenever possible. This approach allows the institution to appear firm without appearing corrupt. It also shifts the public's attention away from the most dangerous element in the story, that a uniform had been used as leverage for intrusion. The reason this element was dangerous is simple. If people believe officers can behave like intruders without consequences, they stop believing the police are morally distinct from criminals. They begin to interpret policing as just another form of power-taking. Frontier legitimacy cannot survive that interpretation. So the cleanup work aimed to keep the police scandal from becoming a police crisis. The town's parallel cleanup, respectable silence. While official cleanup happens through procedure, social cleanup happens through silence. Respectable Edmonton had its own urgent interest: keep the scandal from dragging too many men into visibility. Brothel scandals are contagious. They encourage gossip. Gossip encourages names. Names encourage panic. Panic encourages hasty moral performances, denunciations, calls for raids, sudden concern for public decency. But those moral performances can also backfire. They can lead to questions about who visited where, who paid whom, who tolerated what. So respectable people tend to push for a resolution that feels decisive but not excavatory. They want an ending without inquiry. This is why the town's desire for order after the shooting did not necessarily mean a desire for harsh punishment of Webb. Some wanted that, certainly. Others wanted something quieter, a legal settlement that restored the appearance of control and allowed everyone to go back to not talking about brothels. In a vice-dependent town, silence is not emptiness. It is infrastructure. The problem of the brothel as evidence. A brothel is not just a setting. It is a contaminant. Once the case goes public, everything associated with the brothel becomes morally radioactive. Witnesses who came near it are treated as suspect. Women who worked there are treated as unreliable. Men who visited it are treated as compromised. This works in the state's favor when it wants to discredit certain testimony. It can suggest that women in the house are liars by occupation. It can suggest that their version of events is the kind of story women tell to save themselves. But this also works against the state when it needs witnesses. The more it insists the brothel is a morally contaminated place, the more it undermines the credibility of the very people who saw what happened. So the cleanup had to balance two contradictory needs. Use the brothel to frame Webb as criminal and morally suspect. Avoid making the brothel so contaminated that the prosecution's narrative collapses under disbelief. This balancing act is one reason such cases are so revealing. They show how morality is used selectively as a legal tool rather than as a consistent principle. The narrowing of the event into a charge. A chaotic night contains dozens of possible legal issues. Public drunkenness. Disorderly conduct. breaking and entering, assault, abuse of authority, firearms use, attempted murder, self-defense, and hovering over everything, the ongoing illegality of the brothel itself. The justice system cannot prosecute everything at once, and it does not want to. Prosecutions are not only about law, they are about what a town wants to be seen doing. So the event had to be narrowed. This narrowing would determine the shape of the trial. If the case was framed as Webb shot a constable, then Webb becomes the center and the constable's conduct becomes background. If it was framed as constable's attempted forced entry, Webb defended herself, then the Mounties become the center and the shooting becomes consequence. The institution strongly preferred the first frame, because it allowed the state to continue appearing as the guardian of order. But the facts of the broken door made the second frame hard to eliminate entirely. So a compromise begins to emerge in such cases: acknowledge just enough of the constable's bad behavior to make Webb's defense plausible, while still treating Webb as the legal object to be processed. This is how institutions save themselves. They concede a little to avoid conceding everything. Managing Webb as a symbol. At this stage, Big Nelly Webb stopped being just a person who ran a house. She became a symbol of what the town feared becoming too visible: vice that fights back. A tolerated vice house is manageable. A vice house that resists entry is troublesome. A vice house that shoots a Mountie is intolerable, not morally, but politically. Because it suggests that the state cannot enter every space at will. It suggests that authority is negotiable. It suggests that women, even criminalized women, can draw boundaries and enforce them. This is why the case provoked such intensity. The town did not need Webb to be punished only because a man was shot. It needed Webb to be classified in a way that restored hierarchy. Classification is one of the quiet functions of law. The system classifies some women as respectable and therefore protected. It classifies others as fallen and therefore violable. A madam who successfully claims self-defense threatens that classification, because it implies that even a fallen woman retains rights the system has been ignoring. Cleanup work, then, is not merely about managing paperwork. It is about managing classification. The role of medical description, pain as leverage. Kearney's injury did political work. An injured body in uniform invites sympathy. Sympathy makes it easier to keep attention on the shooting rather than on the forced entry. Sympathy is also a way of silencing criticism. To criticize the officer too sharply is to appear heartless toward his suffering. This is a common dynamic. Institutions use injured bodies as shields, not always consciously, but effectively. The focus shifts from conduct to consequence. He was wounded, therefore whatever he did beforehand becomes less important. But law cannot fully ignore conduct, because conduct is what defines self-defense. So the prosecution had to walk carefully. It needed the jury to feel the weight of the injury without allowing that weight to crush the reality of the forced entry. If the forced entry was acknowledged too openly, the injury would not function as moral leverage. It would function as consequence. That distinction is the entire trial in miniature. The unspoken objective: restore the bargain. Underneath everything, police procedure, civic gossip, moral posturing, sat a single unspoken objective: restore the town's ability to keep functioning as it had before. That does not mean restoring innocence. It means restoring manageability. Edmonton could not abolish brothels overnight without displacing male disorder into the streets and creating a different kind of problem. It could not fully indict its police without weakening the institution it relied on for legitimacy. It could not pretend the scandal never happened because the public had already tasted the story. So it needed a resolution that would reaffirm police authority publicly, discipline misconduct quietly, allow the brothel question to remain officially condemned but practically unresolved, and reseal the town's private life behind doors once again. The courtroom offered a place to attempt that. Court is where a community can symbolically resolve an event without actually changing the conditions that produced it. That is why the next stage matters. Because once the case enters court, the story is no longer told in taverns and kitchens. It is told through the language of law, intent, credibility, justification. And law, like every other institution, will try to make the event fit. Chapter 9, From Shooting to Case File. A violent night does not stay a night for long. Once the shouting fades and the wounded man is carried away, an event begins its second life, the administrative one. This is the life that matters most for history, because it is the life that survives in paper. It is the life through which institutions explain themselves. In Edmonton, the transformation of Big Nelly Webb's shooting into a formal case was not simply a matter of documenting facts. It was an act of translation, turning a morally combustible incident into something the law could hold without catching fire itself. The law does not like contradictions. It prefers clean categories. But this case arrived carrying too many of them. A woman who ran an illegal business. A man in uniform who behaved like an intruder. A door forced open. A warning given. A shot fired at the threshold. A wounded officer who survived to speak. A town that depended on vice while pretending to condemn it. To make this manageable, the system needed to narrow the story. So the paperwork began. The scene becomes evidence. In an ordinary case, a scene is cordoned off, measured, mapped, and treated as a neutral container of truth. In a brothel case, the scene is never neutral. Every physical detail carries moral weight. The house itself is treated as suspect. The people inside are treated as compromised. The fact that it is a brothel becomes, in the public imagination, an explanation for violence, almost as though violence is the natural weather of such places. This is not how violence works. Violence is not weather. It is behaviour. But moral thinking loves to treat certain spaces as inherently violent because it absolves the wider community of responsibility. A brothel is bad. Therefore bad things happen there. If the case could be held inside that logic, the town could avoid confronting the role of its own police. But the door resisted moral logic. A broken door is not a symbol. It is a physical fact. It suggests force. It suggests intrusion. It suggests that whatever happened inside was preceded by a boundary being attacked. So the scene itself contained competing messages. The brothel says, criminal space. The broken door says, forced entry. The threshold says, defensive position. The system's task was to decide which message would be treated as central. Statements, what gets asked, and what is allowed to be answered. The first official statements taken after a scandal often shape everything that follows. They establish what later appears to have been known from the beginning. They also determine which details get repeated and which details vanish. In this case, the selection pressure was immediate. If officials asked the women inside the house detailed questions about the constable's conduct, threats, language, drunkenness, the force used, then those details would become part of the record. They would be available to defense. They would be available to newspapers. They would become difficult to suppress. If officials asked narrower questions, who fired when, where, why, then the broader context could be minimized. It could be treated as irrelevant noise around the central fact, a Mountie was shot. This is where power quietly enters the record. Not always through lies, but through the framing of what counts as relevant. A brothel witness is often interrogated less to discover truth and more to discover weakness. Her credibility is tested aggressively, because the system assumes she is morally unreliable. The questions themselves are shaped by that assumption. They are designed to pull the witness into contradiction or shame. In the Webb case, this dynamic mattered because the defense depended on describing the constables as intruders rather than as offended officers. For the defense, details were everything. For the institution, details were danger. The injured officer as both witness and shield. Constable Kearney's injury gave the mounted police a human center around which sympathy could collect. It also created a problem, because a living wounded officer is not only a symbol, he is a person with a version of events. His version could be clean and official, protecting the uniform, messy and personal, exposing misconduct, or unstable, shifting under pressure. In a scandal, an injured officer is often treated as a witness whose suffering already proves his credibility. His injury becomes an argument. Why would he lie when he has been shot? But injury does not guarantee honesty. It guarantees pain. Pain can shape memory. Pain can encourage self-justification. Pain can invite coaching, because the institution around him has reasons to want his account to fit a safer narrative. None of this requires explicit conspiracy. It happens through ordinary social gravity. A man knows what his colleagues need him to say. He knows what will protect him from shame. He knows what will preserve the image of the uniform. So the official record begins to develop a tendency, common in police scandals, to treat the officer's perspective as default truth and the brothel women's perspective as something that must be proven in spite of itself. This tendency would later be tested in court, naming the act assault, self-defense, or something else. Before a charge is even filed, the event has to be named internally. Naming is classification. Classification determines response. If the act is named as assault on a constable, then the system must respond with severity to maintain authority. If it is named as self-defense, then the system must respond carefully, because acknowledging self-defense by a madam risks legitimizing her boundary and exposing police misconduct. If it is named as a vice-related disturbance, then the system can treat it as a messy incident arising from a messy place, and move quickly to restore order without deeper examination. Institutions often choose names that keep their options open. They charge in a way that allows them to escalate if needed, but also allows them to retreat gracefully if public feeling shifts. This is why the early phases of such cases can look inconsistent, a heavy initial charge followed by a softening later, or a strong public posture followed by quiet adjustment. Edmonton needed flexibility. The case threatened to embarrass the police. Flexibility was survival. Webb's body becomes state property. A crucial moment in any criminal case is the point at which the defendant's body is taken under state control. For Webb, this control carried additional meaning because she was already a criminalized woman. Her business and her reputation made her socially available to judgment in ways respectable women were not. Once she was arrested, the town could read her confinement as a restoration of hierarchy, the madam put in her place. But her confinement also risked making her a martyr to those who recognized the constable's misconduct. If the town saw her as a woman defending herself from drunken intrusion, then harsh handling could backfire. So the system had to manage Webb as both threat and inconvenience. Where was she held? How publicly? Under what conditions? Was she paraded as a warning or kept quiet to avoid inflaming sympathy? These questions are not trivial. They are instruments of narrative. A defendant can be displayed. A defendant can be hidden. Display says, this is what happens when you defy order. Hiding says, let's not keep talking about this. In a scandal, hiding is often the safer choice. The prosecution's dilemma: how to prosecute without exposing the police. If the prosecution moved aggressively against Webb, it risked provoking a defense that centered the broken door and the drunken constables. That defense would put the mounted police on trial culturally, even if not legally. If the prosecution moved too softly, it risked appearing weak toward violence against an officer, undermining authority. So the prosecutor's task was not simply to prove intent. It was to craft a case that punished Webb, or at least processed her, without opening the police to full public humiliation. This is the essence of an institutional scandal. The system is forced to prosecute an event that reveals the system's own vulnerability. In such moments, prosecutors often try to narrow the legal question to something that avoids deeper inquiry. But self-defense cases refuse narrowing. They demand context. They demand motive. They demand description of the threat. The defense would have every incentive to widen the story, which meant the prosecution, paradoxically, had incentive to avoid turning this into a prolonged public spectacle. The case file began to take shape under that pressure. The defense's advantage, the threshold. The defense in a case like this holds a powerful image, the threshold. It is one of the oldest moral images in law: home invasion, forced entry, the right to resist. Even when the home is a brothel, the threshold still carries cultural meaning. People understand doors. They understand locks. They understand what it means to force your way into a space where you have been refused. The defense did not need to romanticize Webb to make this work. It needed only to make the jury see the broken wood and the leg through the frame. The moment the jury sees that, the act begins to look less like aggression and more like prevention. This is why the case file's handling of the door mattered so much. The door was not simply property damage. It was the backbone of justification. The more clearly the door's condition was recorded, the harder it would be to frame Webb as a simple attacker. The town's interest, an ending that restores ordinary life. Behind prosecution and defense sat the town's broader interest: stop the bleeding. Edmonton needed an ending. Not necessarily the most morally right ending, but the ending that would allow the town to return to its nightly bargain. An ending that would let the mounted police recover legitimacy. An ending that would let vice return to private containment. An ending that would let respectable men stop worrying about their names being whispered. A trial could provide that ending. It could also provide the opposite, a prolonged spectacle that kept the scandal alive. This is why case files are not simply legal documents. They are instruments of civic appetite. They reflect what a community is willing to endure publicly. In Edmonton, the community's willingness was limited. The case was too revealing. So the file was built under pressure to be decisive. When an event becomes a question of credibility. By the time the paperwork was complete enough to move toward court, the case had already narrowed itself to a familiar battleground. Who would be believed? A Mountie in pain, wearing the aura of authority. Or a madam, criminalized by occupation, defending a brothel door. This is the cruel simplicity that courts often impose on complex social events. They convert structural questions, police entitlement, tolerated vice, gendered vulnerability, into individual credibility battles. The system prefers this conversion because it makes the broader contradictions disappear. If the jury decides Webb is credible, the system can call it an exceptional case of self-defense and move on. If the jury decides Webb is not credible, the system can punish her and restore hierarchy. Either way, the town does not have to confront why its police were at the brothel door drunk and violent. This is what case files do. They compress society into two voices and ask the jury to choose. Chapter 10: Self-Defense in a Criminalized Space. A courtroom prefers clarity. It is built to produce a clean output, guilty or not guilty, lawful or unlawful, justified or unjustified. It does this by reducing the messy world into a set of opposing narratives, then asking a jury to choose which narrative feels truer within the narrow language the law allows. But some cases resist reduction. Big Nelly Webb's case was one of them, because the central legal question, self-defense, could not be separated from the social condition of the place where it happened. You cannot decide whether a woman reasonably feared harm without admitting what kind of harm was possible in a brothel. You cannot decide whether force was justified without describing how the men at the door behaved. You cannot decide whether her response was excessive without confronting the fact that the intruders wore the authority of the state. This is what made the case so combustible. Self-defense is a legal doctrine, but it is also a cultural test. It reveals whose fear the law recognizes as legitimate. In 1888 Edmonton, the fear of a madam was not automatically considered legitimate. The law had to be forced to look. The problem of respectability as evidence. In many self-defense cases, the defendant's character is treated as a shadow argument. It seeps into jurors' minds even when it is not formally admitted. A respectable person is assumed to be more credible. A disreputable person is assumed to be less so. For women, respectability is not just character. It is a social passport. It determines whether people believe you can be harmed innocently, whether your no is taken seriously, whether your fear is considered reasonable, whether your boundaries are recognized. A brothel keeper is deliberately positioned outside respectability. This is part of how vice regulation works. It makes the woman easier to punish and easier to violate, because she is already classified as morally compromised. So before Webb spoke a word, she entered court carrying a burden. Not the burden of proof, that belongs in theory to the prosecution, but the burden of believability. The jury would not simply ask, "Did she shoot?" That was not in doubt. They would ask, "Did she have the right to?" And embedded in that question was another, does a woman like her have the right to defend a space like that? This is what criminalized space means in practice. It means the law arrives already suspicious of your boundary. The prosecution's simplest story, offense against authority. If the prosecution could have wished the case into an easy shape, it would have looked like this. A known madam shot a constable. The constable was injured. The shooting was unlawful. The defendant is dangerous. This story is clean because it centers authority. It allows the court to behave as though it is defending the state. It avoids the messy interior of the brothel. It avoids the embarrassment of drunk police conduct. It keeps the uniform sacred. But this story had a weakness, the door. The broken door and the forced entry meant that the defense could not be dismissed as a fabrication without someone explaining why a constable was breaking into a building at night. To preserve the simplest story, the prosecution needed to make the forced entry seem less significant. It needed to treat it as a misunderstanding, a minor scuffle, a situation the constable had a right to be in. or a moment Webb exaggerated to justify violence. In other words, it needed to shrink the threat. Self-defense collapses when the threat is shrunk. The defense's essential story, threat and threshold. The defense did not need to build a romantic narrative. It needed only to establish three things. The constables were drunk and aggressive. They forced entry despite warning. Webb fired at the threshold to stop the intrusion. If these three things were believed, self-defense became not only plausible but almost intuitive. People may despise brothels, but they understand the instinct to stop a man breaking down your door. The threshold matters because it signals restraint. It suggests Webb did not chase a man down the street. She did not ambush him. She did not fire into the town. She fired at the moment entry became unavoidable. The threshold frames the shot as last resort rather than vengeance. This is why the defense's most powerful evidence was not rhetorical. It was physical. A jury can picture a door splintering. And when jurors picture that, they picture fear. The contradiction the court could not avoid, a Mountie as intruder. For the jury to accept self-defense, it had to accept something uncomfortable. That a Mountie, symbol of order, could behave like an intruder. This is not simply a matter of one man's behavior. It is a challenge to the institution's image. It forces the jury, and the town behind the jury, to recognize that authority does not prevent misconduct. Sometimes it enables it. This recognition is psychologically difficult for communities that lean on police as proof of civilization. It makes people feel unsafe in a way that is not easily resolved by punishing a madam. So the court's handling of the constables became central. Did the prosecution concede drunkenness? Did it minimize it? Did it treat it as a harmless detail? Did it frame the constables as merely rowdy rather than threatening? Did the defense describe them as predators or as foolish men? These choices shaped how the jury could think. A fool is annoying but not frightening. A predator justifies a gun. The defense needed fear to be seen as reasonable. Reasonableness, whose fear counts. Self-defense turns on reasonableness. Not whether the defendant was afraid, but whether a reasonable person in her position would have been afraid enough to use force. This sounds objective. It is not. Reasonableness is always filtered through class, gender, and moral assumptions. A respectable homeowner facing forced entry is assumed to have a reasonable fear of harm. A madam facing forced entry must often prove that she is not simply violent by nature. This is the moral trap of criminalized space. The law treats your fear as less legitimate because your life is already considered illegitimate. But the facts of the case pushed against that trap. A door being broken by drunk men is a recognizable threat in any setting. Even jurors who despised Webb's occupation could understand that a woman alone, or a group of women, might fear what would happen if drunk men in uniform forced their way into a brothel. And there is another layer that makes the fear even more reasonable. Uniformed men carry power. If a drunken civilian breaks down your door, you might believe the law will protect you afterward. If a drunken officer breaks down your door, you have to fear not only what he will do in the moment, but what he can do afterward, whether he will be believed, whether he can retaliate, whether your complaint will be punished. That fear is specific to police misconduct. It is one of the reasons police violence is uniquely destabilizing. It makes the victim fear both the act and the system. Webb's fear, if the jury accepted it, was not merely fear of assault. It was fear of power unchecked. Violence inside vice spaces, what the town already knew. The courtroom also had to contend with a reality that respectable Edmonton would have preferred to keep unspoken, that violence around brothels was not rare. Brothels attracted drunk men. Drunk men sometimes became violent. Police sometimes intervened. Sometimes police were part of the problem. Everyone knew this in a practical way. Everyone also preferred not to talk about it. The trial forced the town to talk about it indirectly. It forced jurors to imagine what could happen inside a brothel if two drunk constables entered by force. This imagination, even when unspoken, shaped the verdict. People do not have to approve of brothels to know what dangers exist when male entitlement meets female vulnerability. This is why self-defense, in criminalized spaces, becomes an indictment of the social order. To accept it is to accept that the state has left certain women to protect themselves with whatever tools they can. The state does not like this implication. It makes the state look inadequate. The jury as the town's conscience and its shield. A jury verdict does two things at once. It decides the defendant's fate. It also decides what the town will be allowed to believe about itself. If the jury convicted Webb, Edmonton could tell itself a comforting story. The law defended its own, vice was punished, order restored. If the jury acquitted Webb, Edmonton could tell itself a different story, an unfortunate incident, a few drunken men, a woman defending herself, a rare exception, nothing that requires systemic change. An acquittal can function as both acknowledgement and containment. It recognizes self-defense without forcing the town to examine why such self-defense was necessary. This is why acquittals in scandal cases can be politically useful. They release pressure. They provide an ending that prevents further inquiry. The verdict and what it permitted. Webb was acquitted. In legal terms, the court accepted that she acted in self-defense. In social terms, the town accepted something it could not comfortably say out loud, that the Mounties had brought the danger to the door. But the acquittal did not legitimize brothels. It did not transform Webb into a respectable citizen. It did not erase the town's contempt for her occupation. It simply acknowledged that even a woman in an illegal trade could not be required to submit to forced entry by drunk men. This is the crucial nuance. The verdict was not a moral embrace of Webb. It was a practical limit placed on police misconduct, expressed through the only mechanism the town could tolerate, a specific legal finding in a single case. It allowed Edmonton to breathe again. The deeper outcome, the bargain survives, but under strain. After the verdict, Edmonton could return to its routines. Brothels could continue, tolerated and condemned. Police could continue, respected and distrusted. Respectable men could continue, righteous and implicated. The bargain survived. But it survived with a scar, the memory that the bargain can fail, and when it fails loudly. A madam with a gun had forced the town to recognize, if only briefly, that its order was not absolute. It depended on restraint. That is what the night Edmonton lost control means. It does not mean the town descended into chaos permanently. It means that, for one night, the hidden machinery of governance, tolerance, selective enforcement, hypocrisy, became visible in splintered wood and a bullet wound. The system regained control afterward. Systems often do. But the case left a record. And a record, even when the town wants to forget, has a way of continuing to speak. The next chapter follows what happened after the legal ending, how Edmonton contained the meaning of the acquittal, how the mounted police repaired their image, and how Big Nelly Webb's life moved forward, or disappeared, under the weight of being the woman who tested the town's bargain and lived. Chapter 11, Verdict and what it allowed. A verdict is not only a legal decision. It is a civic decision about what the community can bear to know. When Big Nelly Webb was acquitted, Edmonton did not suddenly become enlightened about vice, or generous toward the women it criminalized, or honest about the bargains it relied on. The town simply chose an ending that would stop the scandal from growing. Acquittal did not sanctify Webb. It stabilized Edmonton. That is the distinction that matters. A jury's decision in a case like this does not land in an empty space. It lands on the existing social arrangement, and it either strengthens that arrangement or threatens it. Edmonton needed its arrangement to keep working. It needed the private economy of tolerated vice to keep absorbing male disorder. It needed the mounted police to keep projecting legitimacy. It needed respectable life to keep pretending it was separate from the nightly underworld. So the verdict had to do several things at once. Acknowledge forced entry without indicting the police as an institution. Accept self-defense without legitimizing brothels. Protect the aura of order without rewarding the constable's behavior. And allow the town to move on without further public excavation. The acquittal was the only outcome capable of performing that balancing act. What acquittal means, and what it does not mean. In popular retelling, acquittal is often flattened into celebration. The madam beat the case, the jury stood up to the Mounties, the woman won. That is not how acquittals function in a vice-dependent town. An acquittal in a scandal case often means the community is cutting its losses. It is choosing the resolution that causes the least long-term damage to itself. It is closing the case before the case opens wider questions. The verdict did not mean Edmonton approved of Webb's business. It did not mean the town believed brothels were harmless. It did not mean the town suddenly treated a madam as morally equal to a constable. What it meant, more narrowly, was this. Edmonton was not willing to declare that drunken men in uniform could force entry into a building at night and that the woman inside must submit without resistance. That is a low bar, but it is a crucial one. It is the bar the town had been quietly failing to meet, until the gunshot forced the question. The uniform after the verdict: repair, not reflection. An acquittal leaves an institution with a problem. If the defendant is not guilty, then the event cannot be framed purely as criminal hostility toward police. Some blame must land elsewhere. Yet the institution cannot comfortably admit that its own members created the crisis, because that admission would stain the symbol. So the institution typically does two things. It treats the incident as exceptional. A few men were drunk. A few mistakes were made. This is not the police. This is an anomaly. It restores distance between police and vice publicly. It reasserts the idea that police stand above brothels, even if private reality remains entangled. The Webb case almost demanded this second step. The shooting had dragged the police too visibly into the vice world, and the ridicule that followed had stripped away some of the uniform's seriousness. The institution had to reclaim its posture. This does not necessarily require sweeping reforms. Often it requires small symbolic acts, stricter discipline on paper, more visible patrol presence, occasional enforcement actions, a tightening of behaviour that is less about morality than about optics. Optics are the front line of legitimacy. So after the verdict, one likely effect, whether formally recorded or not, would have been renewed institutional sensitivity about drunkenness, off-duty behaviour, and the appearance of intimacy with brothels. Not because the institution suddenly cared about women's safety, because it cared about being laughed at again. What the verdict allowed the town to pretend. The verdict allowed Edmonton to pretend it had resolved the problem. By acquitting Webb, the town could treat the case as finished, a rare and unpleasant event now contained by law. It could declare implicitly that justice had been done, and therefore no further questions were necessary. This is how legal endings function culturally. They provide permission to stop thinking. The verdict allowed Edmonton to pretend several things. That this was a one-off incident, not a symptom of routine police behavior around vice. That the town's toleration of brothels was under control, despite evidence to the contrary. That the mounted police remained disciplined, despite the drunkenness and humiliation. That women in brothels were generally compliant, despite the fact that Webb had resisted. And that the town's moral order could remain intact because the court had spoken. In other words, the verdict allowed the bargain to be resealed. Brothels could continue operating as tolerated utilities. Respectable life could continue pretending the utilities did not exist. Police could continue as symbols, even if their conduct had been exposed. The machine could keep running. The quiet cost: the verdict did not protect Webb. A jury can acquit a woman and still leave her vulnerable. Webb was acquitted of wrongdoing in that moment, but she remained a madam in a criminalized trade. She remained visible. She remained marked. She remained an easy target for moral blame and enforcement pressure. The acquittal did not grant her respectability. It did not grant her safety. It did not grant her institutional protection. What it granted her was something narrower: the right not to be punished for shooting a man who forced entry. But a woman who publicly humiliates the police, even indirectly, can expect consequences that do not come from courts. Consequences can take the form of tightened enforcement against her business, increased surveillance, harassment under minor pretexts, social hostility, difficulty securing housing or stability, and the constant risk that a future incident will not end as favorably. So the verdict did not end her vulnerability. It simply ended that particular legal crisis. This is one reason historical true crime must resist the urge to treat acquittal as victory. In a town like Edmonton, acquittal often means, we are done talking about this, and you are on your own now. What happened to Big Nelly Webb afterward? The shape of disappearance. One of the most telling aspects of the case is what becomes difficult afterward, tracing Webb as a stable public figure. Not because she suddenly ceased to exist, but because women like her often become less legible to the archive once the scandal passes. They move. They change arrangements. They recede. They become harder to locate in public record unless they collide with institutions again. This is not always intentional secrecy. It can be simple survival. A woman running a brothel learns quickly that visibility is danger. After a high-profile trial, the danger increases. Even a successful defense can produce a new form of exposure. So many such women do what the system encourages them to do. They stop being a story. They become quieter. That quiet is not an admission of guilt. It is a recognition of how power behaves. A woman who has already tested the town once cannot safely test it again. The deeper institutional lesson: self-defense was acknowledged without reform. The court's acceptance of self-defense placed a limit on what the state could do, at least publicly. It suggested that there was a boundary even the uniform could not cross without consequence. But the town did not reform its vice economy. It did not abolish the conditions that made brothels dangerous for women. It did not eliminate the police's entanglement with vice. It did not establish a clean, consistent enforcement regime. It simply absorbed the shock and resumed. This is one of the most important features of institutional life. Systems rarely change because of one scandal. They change only enough to prevent repetition of the same embarrassment. So the lesson the institution likely took was not protect women in criminalized spaces. The lesson was, don't let this happen again where people can see it. That is a very different kind of learning. What the verdict leaves behind. After the verdict, there are usually two separate histories. The official history: the court decided, the case ended, the law functioned. The social history: the town learned what it could not admit and adjusted its behavior quietly. This book is concerned with the second history, because it is the one that reveals how order actually works. Edmonton did not lose control forever. It lost control for one night, the night the bargain became visible. Then it regained control the way systems do, through procedure, selective memory, and quiet adjustment. The verdict allowed that process to begin. Chapter 12: What Remains. Edmonton scandals did not end neatly. They rarely do. They simply changed shape. After the verdict, the town resumed its routines, but it did so with a new sensitivity, like a body that has been bruised and is now aware of where it can be struck again. Brothels did not vanish. Drunkenness did not vanish. Police did not become saints. Respectable men did not become honest about their night lives. What changed was not the existence of the bargain. What changed was the town's awareness of how publicly the bargain could fail. The Webb case left behind more than a legal outcome. It left behind an institutional residue, small adjustments, sharpened instincts, and a memory that authority can be humiliated if it becomes careless where people can see. And it left behind a different kind of residue too, the way the town chose to remember the event, because memory is one of the most important tools of social control. The speed of forgetting, and the work required to forget. There is a particular kind of forgetting that happens after a scandal. Not the forgetting of people who never cared, but the deliberate forgetting of people who cared too much, because the scandal threatened to expose their own lives. Deliberate forgetting is not passive. It is work. It involves changing the subject, discouraging detail, refusing to linger. Edmonton had reasons to forget quickly. The case had dragged the town's private life into view. It forced residents to talk openly, if only briefly, about brothels, drunken constables, and the messy intimacy between law and vice. For a community invested in appearing orderly, that was intolerable. So the forgetting began. It would not have looked like a public announcement. It would have looked like ordinary behavior, fewer conversations, more euphemisms, the tendency to refer to that business rather than describing it, the social tightening that happens when people realize a topic is dangerous. Forgetfulness, in this sense, is a civic reflex, the impulse to protect the town's image. The verdict provided permission to activate that reflex. Now the town could say, officially, that the matter had been resolved. And once the law declares something resolved, it becomes impolite to keep probing it. That is one of the ways the law functions socially. It sets the stopping point. How the story changes once it becomes safe to repeat. When a scandal is fresh, it is volatile. People argue. People defend. People rage. People whisper names. When a scandal becomes old enough, it becomes a story. Stories are safer than scandals because stories can be shaped. They can be trimmed. They can be made amusing. They can be turned into a cautionary tale. They can be stripped of their most uncomfortable truths and still retain their entertaining bones. The Webb case had all the ingredients a frontier town loves. A notorious madam. A uniformed man wounded. A door smashed. A gun fired. A trial that ended unexpectedly. Once enough time passed, this could be retold as, "A madam shot a Mountie." That short sentence carries drama while eliminating the most dangerous element, that the Mountie was behaving like an intruder. The retelling reduces police misconduct into a background murmur and foregrounds the spectacle of a woman violating hierarchy. This is how institutional discomfort is managed culturally. The story keeps the event alive while blunting its critique. It allows the town to remember without learning. The mythic function of Big Nelly. Webb's nickname continued to do the work it was designed to do, turn a person into a type. Big Nelly is not a name you give someone you want to treat as fully human. It is a name that makes her into a figure, large, memorable, slightly comic, slightly threatening. It permits gossip without intimacy. It permits judgment without knowledge. In the years after the trial, her identity could be reduced to the act, the madam who shot the Mountie. That reduction served everyone's needs. It allowed Edmonton to treat the case as exceptional, one notorious woman, one wild incident, rather than as a symptom of ordinary conditions. It also allowed the state to keep its uniform intact. The police could be framed as unlucky rather than culpable. The focus could remain on the shock of a woman using a gun. This is why women in historical true crime are so often remembered through a single act. It is not accidental. It is a cultural technique. Compress the woman into an event so you don't have to consider her as a continuing life. What became of Webb? The archive's quietness as evidence. One of the most honest things the Webb case offers is not a perfect biographical ending. It offers absence. After the scandal, Webb does not remain easily traceable in the public record in the way a man with institutional standing might. She becomes harder to locate, harder to name, harder to follow. This is not unusual. It is the typical fate of women who live on the edges of respectable documentation. For a madam, disappearance is both vulnerability and strategy. It can mean she was pushed out, harassed, made unwelcome. It can also mean she chose to recede, to survive by becoming less visible, less talkable, less reachable by official attention. Either way, the thinness of the record after the trial is not meaningless. It tells you where institutions stop caring. It tells you which lives are preserved as history and which are allowed to vanish. A court preserves the moment it needs. It rarely preserves the life afterward. So what remains of Webb is largely what the town wanted to keep, the event, not the person. That is why the case still matters. It reveals how a woman can be highly visible as a scandal and then become nearly invisible as a human being. The institutional residue, what changes without being named. Edmonton's bargain survived, but it did not survive unchanged. After a public humiliation, institutions tend to tighten seams. They do not announce reforms. They simply become more cautious in certain behaviors, more disciplined in certain optics, more careful in how much mess is permitted to become visible. For the mounted police, the case would have reinforced several lessons. Public drunkenness by officers is reputationally lethal. Off-duty conduct can create on-duty crisis. Entanglement with vice must be managed with more discretion. Allowing the public to laugh at police authority is dangerous. Scandals must be contained quickly through procedure. These are not noble lessons. They are practical ones. For vice operators, the lesson was equally clear. Do not rely on the law for protection. Boundaries must be enforced personally. Visibility is dangerous. If forced to defend yourself, do it at the threshold and do it with witnesses if possible. Never assume the town will protect you after it uses you as a symbol. For the town itself, the lesson was this. The bargain can fail, but it will be resealed. The price of resealing is silence. The public will forgive almost anything if the spectacle ends and ordinary life continues. This is how frontier order reproduces itself, not through moral consistency, but through cycles of exposure and suppression. The case as a map of power. If you strip away the legend and focus on the mechanics, the Webb case becomes a map. It shows where authority is firm, court procedure, public posture. Where authority is weak, off-duty behavior, personal entitlement. Where women are vulnerable, criminalized space, credibility battles. Where towns compromise, tolerated vice, selective enforcement. And where truth becomes negotiable, scandal management, narrative control. In that map, the brothel is not the moral center. The system is. Because the most revealing fact is not that vice existed. Vice exists in every town. The most revealing fact is that the state's representatives behaved in ways that made a woman's firearm feel like the only reliable protection. If a town's order produces that feeling, then order is not the clean thing the town claims. What remains, finally? A woman stood behind a door and refused entry. Men in uniform tried to break through anyway. She warned them. They continued. She fired. The court acquitted her. And the town did what it always does after it sees too much. It looked away. What remains of Big Nelly Webb in the historical imagination is often the simplest version, the madam who shot the Mountie. What remains in the deeper record is more unsettling. A town whose order depended on tolerated illegality and selective enforcement. A police force whose myth could be punctured by ordinary misconduct. A justice system forced to acknowledge briefly that even a criminalized woman could not be expected to submit to forced entry by drunken authority. This is why the case belongs in serious historical true crime. Not because it is lurid. Because it is instructive. Because it shows, with brutal clarity, what happens when the bargain fails and the system scrambles to pretend it never needed the bargain at all. And because it leaves us with the most honest question of all, one that Edmonton answered by silence, and which history reopens every time the story is told. What kind of order depends on pretending it does not know how it actually works? Chapter 13, The Women Inside. A brothel scandal is almost always told through men. The wounded man. The uniformed men. The magistrate. The lawyer. The witnesses who are considered respectable enough to be heard. The businessmen who complain about public morals, while privately consuming the thing they condemn. Women appear in these stories as scenery, nameless girls, inmates, fallen creatures, bodies in rooms. Even the madam, when she becomes visible, is often treated as an exception, an oddity worth gossip, not a person worth understanding. But a house like Big Nelly Webb's did not run on men's speeches. It ran on women's work. If we want the case to mean something beyond spectacle, we have to look at the women inside, not to romanticize them, not to rescue them with sentiment, but to understand the conditions that made self-defense necessary in the first place. Because the night Edmonton lost control was also the night the women's lack of protection became impossible to deny. Life inside a criminalized economy. A brothel is a workplace. It is also a trap. It is a workplace because labor happens there, sexual labor, domestic labor, emotional labor, the constant management of men's moods. It is a trap because the law classifies the workplace as criminal and therefore strips the workers of ordinary protections. When harm occurs, the women are not treated as neutral victims. They are treated as part of the problem. This is how criminalization functions socially. It does not eliminate the activity. It makes the people who do it more vulnerable. In a frontier town, vulnerability is not a philosophical concept. It is the practical reality of what happens when a drunk man becomes violent and the nearest authority is either indifferent or involved. Women in brothels often lived under a thin layer of safety created by routine. Routine customers, routine rules, routine boundaries. Routine can feel like stability. It can even feel like choice. But routine is fragile. It breaks under intrusion, and intrusion was always a possibility because the house existed under conditions of tolerated illegality. A tolerated illegal house has no secure legal standing. At any moment, the tolerance can end. At any moment, police can enter not to protect but to punish. At any moment, men can treat the place as a space where they can do what they like because the women's credibility has been pre-damaged by their occupation. So even on quiet nights, safety is provisional. That is what it means to live inside a criminalized economy. You are always aware that your ability to appeal to law is compromised. The madam as the nearest thing to authority. In such conditions, the madam becomes more than a manager. She becomes, for the women inside, the nearest thing to an institution that can enforce boundaries. She decides who enters. She decides who is refused. She decides which men are too drunk, too loud, too violent. She may negotiate with police. She may pay to keep raids away. She may maintain a relationship with certain men in authority to protect the house, or at least to reduce its exposure. This is not nobility. It is logistics. A madam is also a buffer. She absorbs male entitlement so the women do not have to absorb it directly. She takes the first insult. She receives the first threat. She is the one who stands at the threshold and says no. That role is one reason madams often develop reputations for hardness. Hardness is not a personality quirk. It is a required trait. Softness gets you killed. If Webb stood behind that door with a revolver, she was not only defending herself. She was defending the women inside from an intrusion that could have become far worse than a broken door. The law later would focus on the wounded constable. But the women inside would have been thinking of a different risk, what two drunk men in uniform might do once they entered a house where women had limited credibility and fewer ways to fight back. What the women likely understood in the moment. When the door began to crack, the women inside would not have needed a lecture on danger. They would have known the pattern. A drunk man refused. The refusal becomes humiliation. Humiliation becomes aggression. Aggression becomes force. A brothel is a place where this pattern repeats frequently enough to become familiar. The difference that night was the uniform. Uniforms change the stakes. A drunken civilian forcing entry is frightening. A drunken constable forcing entry carries an additional terror. Even if you survive the encounter, the institution may blame you for what happened. The law may punish you for resisting. The public may believe him over you. Your own attempt to seek justice may become the mechanism of your humiliation. This is why police misconduct in vice spaces is uniquely dangerous. It makes women fear both the act and the aftermath. So when Webb warned the men she was armed, the warning was not only addressed to the men outside. It was also a signal to the women inside. I'm trying to stop this before it enters the rooms. The women would have understood what the gun meant. Not drama. A last resort. The state's favorite tactic: discredit the women. In court, and in public discussion, women in brothels are routinely treated as unreliable witnesses. Their testimony is doubted because their work is doubted. Their memories are treated as self-serving. Their words are filtered through a moral judgment. If a woman sells sex, then she sells truth too. This tactic is not subtle, and it is not new. It is one of the oldest mechanisms by which violence against marginalized women is made easier. If the woman will not be believed, the man's violence becomes safer. The Webb case carried this mechanism into the open. If the prosecution wanted to frame Webb as an aggressor, it could rely on the assumption that the women inside would lie to protect themselves. If the defense wanted to establish the constable's misconduct, it had to fight the assumption that women in a brothel cannot be trusted. So the women's credibility became a battleground even when their names did not remain prominent. And the outcome, acquittal, suggests that, at least in this case, the women's description of the threat could not be fully erased by moral contempt. That is remarkable not because the system became fair, but because the facts were too stubborn to bury. A broken door is a witness that cannot be discredited as a fallen woman. The women's exposure after the case. Even when a madam is acquitted, the women inside the house rarely benefit. A public case brings attention. Attention brings raids. Raids bring arrests. Arrests bring fines, records, humiliation, and in some cases removal from town. The women who worked in the house could be made to pay the cost of the scandal simply because they were easier to punish than police. A town may not be able to discipline its uniformed men publicly without weakening authority, but it can always punish women in vice spaces without risk. This is the hidden cruelty of scandal management. It restores public order by sacrificing those who already had the least protection. So even if Webb escaped conviction, the women around her may have faced heightened pressure afterward, intensified enforcement, heightened surveillance, fewer safe arrangements. A case like this does not end danger. It redistributes it. What a brothel door is really for. A door is not merely a barrier. In a brothel, it is a filter. It is one of the few tools women have to decide which men enter the space where they must work and live. It is also one of the few tools women have to prevent the worst kinds of violence, violence that occurs when men believe they have access without consequence. This is why the forced entry matters so deeply. It was not simply property damage. It was a direct attack on the women's ability to control their environment. When the men outside tried to break down the door, they were not only seeking entry. They were asserting a principle. Your boundaries do not matter. When Webb fired, she asserted the opposite principle. They do. In a respectable home, that principle is assumed. In a brothel, it has to be enforced. That is the grim difference. The quiet political meaning of the shot. The law prefers to treat self-defense as an individual decision in an isolated moment. But in Webb's case, the shot carried quiet political meaning even if no one spoke of it that way. It was not politics in the modern ideological sense. It was politics in the oldest sense, the distribution of power over bodies. A madam using force against a constable challenged the assumed hierarchy of the town. That police can enter vice spaces with impunity. That women in those spaces must submit. That order is something applied to women, not to men in uniform. The acquittal did not overthrow that hierarchy, but it placed a limit on one corner of it. It suggested that there is a point at which even the town will not demand female submission to police intrusion. The limit is narrow, but it exists. And it exists because the women's vulnerability was, for one night, visible enough to trigger ordinary human recognition. If men break in, something terrible could happen. That recognition is often the only defense marginalized women receive from a system that otherwise treats them as expendable. What the women's presence reveals about Edmonton. When you look at the women inside Webb's house, the case becomes less about one notorious madam and more about Edmonton's structure. It becomes a case study in how a frontier town manages male demand. By outsourcing it into criminalized spaces. By treating the women in those spaces as morally disposable. By tolerating the spaces while denying them protection. By allowing police to become entangled with the very thing they are supposed to regulate. And by only acknowledging women's boundaries when the cost of ignoring them becomes publicly unbearable. That is the town's bargain laid bare. The women inside were the price. They were always the price. The next chapter returns to the external theater, the newspapers, the public retellings, and the way the case was packaged into something repeatable. Because once women's lives become legible only through scandal, the story they are given afterward is rarely the story they lived. It is the story the town can tolerate. Chapter 14, The Papers, the Public, and the Making of a Story. A town does not remember an event the way it happened. It remembers the version that was easiest to repeat. In Edmonton, the Webb shooting entered public life through the same machinery that has always shaped crime into meaning: newspapers, gossip, and the appetite for stories that confirm what people already believe about women, vice, and authority. The formal record, charges, testimony, verdict, sat inside files and courtrooms. The public record lived elsewhere, in headlines, in moral commentary, in the way a single sentence could travel faster than a detailed truth. A madam shot a Mountie. That line is portable. It fits in a breath. It carries shock. It carries judgment. It carries just enough detail to arouse curiosity and just enough vagueness to allow listeners to fill in what they want to believe. But it is also incomplete, and the incompleteness is not accidental. Incomplete stories are useful. They allow institutions and communities to keep their most uncomfortable facts off stage. The purpose of this chapter is not to scold the press or romanticize the past. It is to show how quickly an event becomes a product, how the public turns a messy institutional crisis into a tale with familiar roles. Because once the case became a story, it began doing work for the town. Headlines as moral sorting. Crime reporting does more than inform. It sorts. It tells readers who to fear, who to pity, who to despise, and what kind of social order should be protected. In a case like Webb's, the press had a choice: emphasize the victimhood of the wounded constable, or emphasize the misconduct that produced the confrontation. Most reporting cultures lean toward protecting the uniform. This is especially true in frontier settings where police legitimacy is still being constructed. A young town wants its guardians to look competent. The press often participates in that desire. At the same time, vice stories sell. A madam with a gun sells better than administrative embarrassment following off-duty misconduct. The press is not immune to audience appetite. It is often shaped by it. So even if reporting included details of forced entry, the gravitational pull of sensationalism encouraged a particular framing: vice plus violence equals moral spectacle. Under that framing, the brothel becomes the story, not the door. And once the brothel becomes the story, the public can treat the case as proof of vice's danger rather than as proof of authority's weakness. This protects the town's self-image. It locates the problem in an already condemned space. Women as spectacle, men as institutions. One of the quiet patterns in historical crime reporting is this: women become spectacle. Men become institutions. A woman in a crime story is described physically. Her body, her manner, her dress, her type. Even when the tone is disapproving, it lingers. This attention allows the public to consume her as entertainment while also condemning her. Men, especially uniformed men, are described differently. They are treated as representatives. Their behavior is not always interrogated as personal conduct. It is often described as the behavior of the role. This matters because it affects how blame is distributed. When Webb becomes spectacle, she becomes easy to blame. Her existence as a madam becomes a moral explanation for everything. The public does not have to think about why constables were there, they only have to think about what kind of woman would shoot. When Kearney becomes institution, his private misconduct can be softened. He becomes a Mountie, not a drunk man forcing entry. His injury becomes an injury to the uniform. His pain becomes a civic offense. This is how narrative protects authority. The brothel as a symbol the town can handle. Edmonton could handle a vice story. Vice stories are familiar. They allow people to feel morally superior while indulging curiosity. They allow officials to posture. They allow sermons to be preached. They allow the town to reassert its values without changing its behavior. Edmonton could not easily handle a policing story. A policing story invites the wrong questions. If the police behave badly, what protects us? If the uniform is not disciplined, what is the state? If constables can force entry into a brothel, can they force entry elsewhere? Can women ever refuse them? These questions threaten the town's sense of itself. So one of the subtle functions of public storytelling after the verdict was to steer the memory away from policing weakness and back toward vice as spectacle. This could be done even while acknowledging self-defense. The case could be remembered as that wild madam who shot a Mountie, rather than that night drunken constables tried to break in. The difference is everything. One story embarrasses the police. The other story embarrasses the woman. A town will often choose the second. How humor helps society avoid truth. In the months and years after such an event, humor becomes a form of historical editing. Humor keeps the story alive while draining it of its most dangerous meaning. You can joke about Mounties being drunk. You can joke about stolen gear. You can joke about a madam's audacity. Laughter allows people to acknowledge what happened without confronting what it implies. It converts scandal into folklore. Folklore is safer than scandal because folklore does not require accountability. It requires only repetition. And the Webb case was perfect for folklore. Colorful characters, moral contradiction, a sudden gunshot, a trial, a verdict. Once a case becomes folklore, it stops being a lesson and becomes entertainment. That is one of the ways systems protect themselves over time. They allow their failures to be remembered only as jokes. The courtroom versus the street. The verdict, legally, said, self-defense. But the street does not always accept the courtroom's logic. People make their own verdicts based on their moral instincts. For some, Webb would always remain a dangerous criminal woman who injured authority. For others, she would become a symbol of a woman refusing intrusion. For others still, she would become a figure of rough comedy. These street verdicts matter because they determine what kind of memory persists. In a town dependent on both vice and authority, the safest memory is one that preserves both. Preserve the police by treating misconduct as funny rather than corrupt. Preserve vice by treating it as inevitable, contained, and not worth dismantling. Preserve respectability by treating scandal as an exception rather than a symptom. Preserve gender hierarchy by keeping the woman's story as spectacle. A story can do all of this at once. That is why stories survive. What gets lost when the story hardens? When the Webb case is remembered only as Madam shoots Mountie, several things vanish. The labor inside the house. The fear that made self-defense reasonable. The institutional pressure to contain embarrassment. The town's dependence on vice. The violence of forced entry. The vulnerability of women in criminalized spaces. The legal nuance that acquittal was not approval. The way the system retreated strategically to regain control. The story that survives is cleaner, sharper, and less truthful. But it is useful. It allows the town, and later audiences, to consume the event without being implicated in its structure. Why this matters for historical true crime. Historical true crime is at its best when it refuses the easy story. The easy story offers characters. The hard story offers systems. Big Nelly Webb's case, told properly, is not simply an anecdote about a madam with nerve. It is an institutional case study about how a frontier town governs itself through selective enforcement and social denial, and how quickly that governance is threatened when the people tasked with enforcing order behave like intruders. The press and public memory tried, as they often do, to turn the case into spectacle. This book resists that not out of moral superiority, but because spectacle is lazy. It tells us nothing about why the event happened and why it mattered. The discomforting truth is this. Edmonton's order depended on women in brothels being vulnerable. The moment a woman refused vulnerability loudly enough to make it public, the town had to choose between punishing her and exposing itself. It chose the only outcome that allowed it to stop talking. Then it converted the event into a story it could live with. What remains when you strip the story back down? When you remove the legend, the case becomes stark again. A door was broken by men who believed they could enter. A woman warned them. They continued. She fired at the threshold. The court accepted her fear as reasonable. The town moved on. The story became folklore. That is the trajectory of many scandal cases. Not because history is poetic, but because societies are repetitive. Chapter 15. Afterlife of a scandal. A scandal is often described as though it is a rupture, an explosion that changes everything. In practice, most scandals function differently. They are not revolutions. They are stress tests. They reveal where a system is fragile. Then the system adapts, not to become fairer, but to become harder to embarrass. Edmonton's response to Big Nelly Webb's case followed that pattern. The town did not abolish vice. It did not transform policing. It did not build a clean wall between public morality and private behaviour. It did what most institutions do after public humiliation. It tightened its seams. Some of that tightening is visible in records. Much of it is not. It lives in altered habits, in new cautions, in the small internal rules that people follow without naming them. The afterlife of the scandal, then, is not a neat series of reforms. It is a set of adjustments, quiet learning. What the mounted police could not afford to learn publicly. The mounted police could not publicly admit the case revealed a cultural problem. They could not say, "Our men drink too much, feel entitled to vice, and sometimes behave like intruders." They could not say, "Our authority depends on the town believing we are better than we are." They could not say, "Our control is partly theatrical." To admit those things would be to weaken the uniform. So if the institution learned anything, it had to learn it in ways that did not require confession. This is how police organizations often adapt after scandal. They make selective examples internally. They tighten certain behaviors in public-facing contexts. They increase discipline where it is visible. They become more careful about optics. And they reinforce loyalty to the institution as a shield against outside scrutiny. A likely consequence of the Webb case was heightened awareness of one specific risk, not vice itself, but vice becoming public embarrassment. The incident showed that police involvement with brothels was not only a moral hazard. It was a reputational hazard. Reputational hazards produce management. The difference between discipline and reform. After a public scandal, institutions often mistake discipline for reform. Discipline is behavioral tightening, fewer officers seen drunk in uniform, fewer obvious entanglements, stricter adherence to procedure when eyes are watching. Reform is structural change, reducing entitlement, addressing power abuse, changing culture, establishing accountability that works even when the public is not watching. Frontier institutions rarely have the capacity or the appetite for reform. They are built for control, not introspection. So discipline is the more probable outcome. It is also the outcome that allows an institution to claim improvement without altering its internal power structures. The Webb case provided a strong incentive for discipline. It had turned officers into a public joke. That alone can trigger a crackdown, not necessarily because leadership suddenly values ethics, but because leadership values authority. Authority cannot survive laughter. How a town quietly reseals its bargains. Edmonton's bargain with vice, tolerate it, condemn it, use it, had been exposed. The exposure was not comfortable. So the town would have attempted to reseal it. Resealing does not mean eliminating vice. It means making vice less visible and more manageable again. It can involve pushing brothels farther from respectable streets, increasing periodic enforcement to appease moral voices, encouraging operators to keep noise and violence contained, relying on informal warnings rather than public raids, and ensuring that confrontations do not spill into spectacle. In other words, resealing is a kind of civic hygiene. It cleans the surface without changing what exists beneath. The Webb case taught the town that a door conflict can erupt into a headline. One lesson, therefore, was simple: prevent door conflicts from happening where the public can hear. This can lead to a grim shift, greater toleration of vice as long as it remains quiet, alongside harsher punishment when it becomes noisy. Silence becomes the criterion, not justice. The women's afterlife, increased vulnerability disguised as order. For the women who lived and worked in vice houses, tightening seams often translates into increased pressure. After a scandal, police may increase raids not because they believe in morality but because they need to be seen doing something. Those raids fall hardest on women, because women are easier to arrest than constables. They are less politically protected. They are less institutionally defended. So a scandal caused by police misconduct can perversely lead to more punishment for the women police claim to regulate. This is one of the cruel loops of vice enforcement. Misconduct occurs. Public embarrassment follows. Officials respond with enforcement theater. Enforcement theater targets the most disposable bodies. The institution protects itself, and the vulnerable pay the cost. It restores the image of order by sacrificing those already marginalized. This is why acquittal was not a victory for women in general. It was a limit placed on one confrontation. The broader structure of vulnerability remained. The paradox of tolerated vice: the town needs it to survive. Frontier towns often rely on vice to keep functioning. They rely on saloons, gambling rooms, and brothels to manage the social consequences of male migration, loneliness, seasonal money, and limited domestic structures. This reliance is not romantic. It is logistical. But reliance creates a paradox. You cannot eliminate what you depend on without destabilizing the town, yet you cannot admit dependence without damaging the town's moral self-image. So vice is regulated not toward elimination, but toward containment. The Webb case showed containment can fail. A door can splinter. A gun can fire. A constable can bleed. A town can laugh. So the town's afterlife response would likely have been to invest more energy in keeping the containment working. Not in making it fair. In keeping it quiet. The case is a warning: misread on purpose. Every scandal is later turned into a lesson. The key question is, who gets to write the lesson? For moral reformers, the lesson might be, brothels are dangerous, eradicate vice. For police, the lesson might be, do not let private behavior become public disgrace. For brothel keepers, the lesson might be, if you cannot rely on the law, strengthen your boundaries and your private protections. For respectable townsfolk, the lesson might be, stop talking about these things and let the town return to normal. These lessons point in different directions. The strongest lesson, the one most useful to a power structure, is the one that reduces future embarrassment without altering power. So the Webb case was likely absorbed as a warning against visibility. Not, stop abusing authority. But, stop doing it where it becomes a headline. This is how institutions misread their own failures. They treat exposure as the problem, not the behavior. Why the scandal still matters after it ends. Historically, it is tempting to treat the case as concluded the moment the verdict is delivered. But scandals rarely end at verdict. They end when the system has successfully resumed its normal functioning, when the bargain is back in place, the story has hardened into folklore, and people no longer feel compelled to speak carefully. Edmonton achieved that. The town did not become pure. It became quiet again. And quietness is not innocence. It is management. That is why the Webb case matters as historical true crime. It shows a frontier system operating under stress and revealing its actual mechanisms: selective enforcement, gendered credibility, institutional self-preservation, and the containment of public embarrassment. The afterlife of Big Nelly Webb, a life made unsafe by its own visibility. After a woman becomes famous as a scandal figure, she is rarely allowed an ordinary life. Visibility attracts enforcement, hostility, and exploitation. It can also attract a kind of unwanted myth-making that replaces the person with a caricature. For a madam, this is particularly dangerous. Her safety depends on controlled access and controlled reputation. Scandal fractures control. It makes her a target. So the most plausible afterlife for Webb, whether she stayed in Edmonton or moved elsewhere, is a life lived under heightened risk, in which discretion becomes not merely a business strategy but a survival tactic. The archive, predictably, does not preserve this life well. It preserves the flash, not the long burn. That absence is itself evidence of how historical record treats women like Webb, visible only when they collide with institutions, invisible when they try to simply live. What Edmonton learned, in the end. If you ask what Edmonton learned from the night it lost control, the answer is not inspiring. It learned how close disorder sits to authority when authority behaves badly. It learned how quickly respectability can be threatened by its own private habits. It learned that a woman in a brothel might defend her threshold and be believed, once. It learned that public laughter can undo uniformed legitimacy faster than any courtroom. And most of all, it learned the oldest institutional lesson. Control is not the same as justice, but it is often treated as more urgent. The town regained control after the verdict. It did not necessarily gain justice. The distinction is the shadow the case leaves behind, an afterlife of tightened seams, resealed bargains, and a story remembered in a way that protects the system more than it honors the truth. The next chapter moves toward closure, what this case reveals when placed against the broader landscape of women, vice, and policing in the late 19th century, and why a single gunshot at a doorway can tell us more about order than 100 speeches about morality. Chapter 16. The Limits of Order. Edmonton liked to speak of order as though it were a permanent state, something established by law, maintained by uniform, and threatened only by criminals and outsiders. The Webb case demonstrates the opposite. Order in a frontier town was not permanent. It was conditional. It depended on bargains, on selective enforcement, on private tolerance, and on the public's willingness to believe in symbols even when the people inside those symbols behaved badly. This is what the case reveals, stripped of drama. Order was not simply enforced. It was performed. And the performance could fail. Order depends on who is allowed to say no. At the center of the Webb case is a refusal. The refusal matters because it identifies the true boundary the town was maintaining. It was not merely a boundary between legality and illegality. It was a boundary between people who were permitted to refuse and people who were expected to comply. In Edmonton's moral economy, the women inside a brothel were expected to comply. Their compliance kept the bargain intact. Their compliance kept men's private appetites from becoming public disturbance. Their compliance kept the police's unofficial entanglements from becoming official scandals. When the brothel door stayed shut, it violated that expectation. It turned a tolerated illegal space into a space with a boundary. A boundary requires respect. That respect was not given. So the door became the point where order was tested, not in theory, but in force. If order cannot tolerate refusal from a criminalized woman, it is not order. It is domination. The gunshot was the moment domination met resistance. The uniform as a tool, not a guarantee. The case also forces a sober view of policing. The Mounties were central not because they were attacked, but because their off-duty conduct revealed the gap between the institution's myth and its daily habits. The NWMP were expected to be the disciplined edge of the state. Yet on that night, they behaved like ordinary drunk men with extraordinary power. This matters historically because it shows the essential truth of policing. The uniform does not prevent misconduct. It can enable it. When a constable is drunk, his drunkenness is not just personal weakness. It is weakness attached to authority. It transforms private appetite into public threat, because the man carries legitimacy and presumed credibility even when he behaves badly. This is why police misconduct is uniquely destabilizing. It makes the community question the neutrality of the very institution meant to protect it. It makes women question whether the system will ever recognize their fear as reasonable. In Webb's case, the court did recognize her fear, once. But the need for recognition was itself the indictment. The town's relationship with vice, dependence disguised as condemnation. Edmonton's response makes sense only when you accept a hard truth: the town needed vice. The town needed saloons to absorb men's wages and restlessness. It needed gambling to keep money circulating. It needed brothels to provide an outlet for male demand that could not be satisfied inside respectable life. Yet it could not admit needing these things without damaging its moral self-image. So it condemned what it used. That is the essence of tolerated vice, dependence disguised as denunciation. The Webb case threatened this disguise. It made the underworld visible not as a distant moral problem but as part of the town's functional infrastructure. It showed that respectable Edmonton was not separate from the brothel economy, it was upstream from it, feeding it and relying on it. The town's anxiety after the shooting was not only fear of violence. It was fear of being seen. Justice as containment. The legal system's response, trial, acquittal, can be read as an act of justice. It can also be read, more honestly, as an act of containment. The court's verdict did not reform policing. It did not protect brothel women broadly. It did not resolve the vice economy. It simply answered the narrowest possible question in the narrowest possible terms. In this case, she was not guilty. That narrowness is what made it useful. It allowed Edmonton to stop talking without changing its structures. It allowed the mounted police to survive without systemic confession. It allowed vice to return to its tolerated spaces. It allowed respectable life to return to its comfortable denial. Containment is often mistaken for resolution. But containment is not resolution. It is management. The Webb case shows justice operating as management, a way to stabilize a community after it has been forced to see too much. Gender and credibility, whose fear is reasonable. If the Webb verdict was a limit placed on authority, it was also a rare recognition of women's fear as reasonable within a space the law otherwise criminalized. This recognition did not arise from sudden empathy. It arose from a collision of stubborn facts. Forced entry, a broken door, a warning, and a shot at the threshold. These facts made the threat legible even to jurors trained to mistrust women like Webb. They made it difficult to claim she had acted from malice rather than necessity. Yet the very need for such physical proof shows how credibility works. A respectable woman's fear is often presumed. A criminalized woman's fear must be demonstrated. The difference is structural. It is part of how power decides which bodies deserve protection. The case, therefore, does not tell us that the system was fair. It tells us that the system was forced briefly to behave as though it might be. Why this case endures? It endures because it is not simply sensational. It is explanatory. It shows how frontier order was built. On selective enforcement rather than moral consistency. On institutions that protected their symbols more than their victims. On the quiet outsourcing of male disorder into criminalized women's spaces. And on a public willingness to accept hypocrisy as long as it remained unseen. It also shows the moment those mechanisms fail. A gunshot at a doorway is a small event in the scale of a town's history. Yet it can expose an entire system because it forces questions that cannot be answered with slogans. What is the law when the law behaves lawlessly? What is order when order requires women to surrender boundaries? What is justice when its primary purpose is to stop scandal rather than change conditions? Edmonton's answer was not a speech. It was a verdict that allowed the town to resume. The final measure of control. The title of this book speaks of a night Edmonton lost control. The truth is subtler. Edmonton lost control of its narrative. It lost the ability to keep vice and authority in separate compartments. It lost the ability to keep police weakness unseen. It lost the ability to pretend the bargain did not exist. The town regained control not by becoming more truthful, but by restoring silence, tightening optics, and converting scandal into story. That is what control often means. Control is not the presence of justice. It is the absence of noise. Big Nelly Webb's gunshot created noise loud enough to expose the bargain. The verdict quieted it. The town moved on. The system survived. And that, in the end, is the most accurate definition of the limits of justice in a frontier town. Justice can occasionally restrain power. But power will always seek to preserve itself first. That is what the Webb case leaves behind, not as folklore, but as record. A door held until it broke. A warning was given and ignored. A woman defended a threshold. And a town, briefly forced to see itself, chose silence again. Chapter 17, Closing the Record. A true crime narrative ends twice. It ends once when the event stops producing immediate consequences, when the wounded man lives or dies, when the courtroom empties, when the town's attention drifts to the next disturbance. It ends again when the record closes, when the archive stops following the people involved, when names become harder to trace, when the case becomes an anecdote rather than a living wound. The Webb case ended in that second way. The verdict gave Edmonton permission to stop. The town took it. The police tightened their seams. Vice resumed its quiet function. The story settled into the shape the town could tolerate. The record, however, remained open enough to leave a final question hanging. Not a melodramatic one, not the kind that invites speculation, but the kind that reveals how history treats certain lives. What happens to a woman after she becomes the woman who embarrassed authority? For many respectable figures, history offers continuity, public roles, written traces, repeated mention. For women like Webb, history offers a flash of visibility and then often a narrowing into silence. That silence is not empty. It is the archive doing what it has always done, preserving the state's concerns while letting marginal lives dissolve unless they collide with institutions again. The case as an institutional document, not a human biography. Court records are not designed to preserve lives. They are designed to resolve disputes and reinforce authority. This is why, once the verdict is delivered, the documents tend to lose interest in the defendant as a person. The system has done what it needed to do. It has processed a crisis, produced an outcome, and restored the appearance of control. Whatever happens to Webb afterward, whether she stayed, moved, changed trades, died quietly, or lived long enough to watch the town become something else, is not in the system's eyes the system's concern. In this way, the record itself becomes part of the case's meaning. The record tells us what the state values. The injury to an officer. The legal justification for violence. The maintenance of public order. The procedural ending that allows life to continue. It tells us what the state does not value. The ongoing vulnerability of women in criminalized spaces. The aftermath of public exposure on a marginal life. The long-term consequences of police misconduct for those most at risk. To notice this is not to demand that court records become novels. It is to recognize that institutional documentation is always selective, and that selectivity shapes historical memory. How a town seals off embarrassment. After an acquittal, there is a temptation to read the outcome as closure. But closure is not a natural consequence of legal process. Closure is something a community actively produces. It is the social decision to stop circulating details and to reduce the event to a manageable label. In Edmonton, that label was ready-made. The madam who shot the Mountie. It keeps the focus on the woman. It keeps the focus on spectacle. It turns a structural embarrassment into a colorful anecdote. It allows the police to remain the police, rather than an institution capable of drunken intrusion. This is how communities preserve their symbols. They narrate around them. The scandal's sharpest truths become blunt over time. The door becomes a footnote. The forced entry becomes a vague altercation. The women inside become invisible again. The police return to their public posture. And because the town's daily functioning depends on these postures, the sealing off succeeds. The real boundary the case established. The Webb verdict can be read as the law drawing a line. But the line it drew was not moral. It was practical. It did not say, brothels deserve protection. It did not say, police must be accountable. It did not say, women's boundaries are sacred. It said something narrower. There is a point at which forced entry becomes so undeniable that even a criminalized woman may resist without being punished. That is the boundary the case established. A thin boundary, but real. It is worth holding on to this nuance because it prevents a common distortion in historical true crime, turning rare legal limits into imagined social victories. Webb did not win a feminist triumph in a frontier court. She survived a collision with authority because the facts were too blunt to deny and because the town needed an ending that preserved itself. Survival here is not a metaphor. It is the honest measure. What the case teaches without preaching. This book has been written without a moral narrator hovering over the story, telling you what to think. That restraint matters because the case is already instructive. The Webb shooting shows, in practical detail, how vice becomes municipal infrastructure while remaining publicly condemned. How policing can operate through both law and informal entitlement. How women's credibility is negotiated through moral classification. How courts function as containment chambers for public embarrassment. How communities convert scandal into folklore to avoid learning its implications. And how order often means quiet rather than justice. These lessons are not theoretical. They are visible in the physical facts: a broken door, a warning, a leg through a frame, a bullet wound, an acquittal. This is the value of fact-based historical true crime. It does not require speculation to reveal structure. It only requires attention. Why the story belongs to Edmonton's history. It would be easy to treat the Webb case as an odd frontier anecdote, colorful, shocking, safely contained in the past. But it belongs to Edmonton's history for a more serious reason. it exposes the mechanics by which a young town governs itself. In the late 19th century, civilization on the frontier was an aspiration more than a completed condition. It was assembled through symbols, police, courts, churches, newspapers, and through the daily compromises that kept life functioning. The Webb case shows those compromises in motion. It shows what the town tolerated. It shows what the town denied. It shows what the town feared being forced to see. And it shows the moment when the town's own agents of order behaved in ways that made a gunshot feel, to the person behind the door, like the only viable boundary. That is not just a crime story. It is a governance story. A final image. When people remember this case, they often remember the shot. A gun. A wounded Mountie. A madam with nerve. But the more revealing image is earlier, quieter, and more precise. A door under pressure. A door is not dramatic. It is ordinary. It is the everyday technology of boundaries. It is the thing that makes private life possible. In a town where certain women were not granted private life in the same way, the door becomes even more important. It is one of the few ways to insist that there is an inside and an outside, and that the person inside has a say. The constables tested that. Webb refused. The town's bargain failed in the splintering wood. And the rest, trial verdict folklore, was Edmonton's attempt to pretend it had not. That is what closing the record means here, not that the questions are answered, but that the town stopped asking them. History, less polite, keeps them open. Conclusion, a threshold, remembered. If this case has a center, it is not the courtroom, the verdict, or even the gunshot. It is the threshold. A threshold is where systems reveal themselves. It is where permission is tested. It is where authority decides whether it recognizes a boundary or crushes it. It is where a town's private habits collide with its public claims. On one October night in 1888, Edmonton's threshold failed, not because it was weak, but because the men who struck it believed it should not exist. Everything that followed, the injury, the trial, the acquittal, the forgetting, flowed from that belief. What the case does not say. This is not a story that proves the frontier was uniquely lawless. Nor is it a story that declares policing inherently corrupt, or vice inherently destructive, or women in brothels inherently virtuous or doomed. The case does not ask us to choose heroes. It asks us to notice structure. It shows that authority, when unchecked by accountability, becomes entitlement. It shows that criminalization does not remove activity, it removes protection. It shows that systems built on selective enforcement can function smoothly for years, until one refusal exposes how unevenly power has been distributed. The Webb case does not say Edmonton was worse than other towns. It says Edmonton was ordinary. What the case does say, quietly, insistently. It says that order is not maintained by law alone. It is maintained by compliance. When compliance is expected from those with the least protection, the system appears stable. When compliance is withdrawn, especially by someone the system has trained itself not to listen to, the illusion fractures. Big Nelly Webb did not set out to test the limits of justice. She did not need theory. She responded to pressure the way many people do when they are cornered and abandoned by the law. She enforced the only boundary available to her. The law, forced to look, conceded that the boundary existed. That concession was small. It was narrow. It was temporary. But it was real. Why silence followed? Afterward, silence returned, not because the case lacked significance, but because it had too much. To keep talking would have required Edmonton to confront uncomfortable truths. That its police were not morally separate from the vice they policed. That its tolerance of brothels was functional rather than accidental. That women's safety had been outsourced to criminalized spaces. That order depended on things remaining unseen. Silence allowed the town to avoid reckoning. And silence is often mistaken for peace. The limits of justice, made visible. The subtitle of this book speaks of the limits of justice. Those limits are not philosophical abstractions. They are practical boundaries, points at which the law stops asking questions because further inquiry would destabilize the system that enforces it. Justice, in this case, went far enough to stop punishment. It did not go far enough to demand change. That is not a failure unique to Edmonton. It is a pattern visible wherever authority depends on appearances and where marginal lives are treated as acceptable collateral. Justice drew a line and then stepped back. The town accepted the line because it was narrow enough to live with. What history keeps, and what it lets go. History kept the shark. It kept the nickname. It kept the headline version. It kept the folklore. What it nearly lost was the mechanism. That is why this case matters as historical true crime, not as a curiosity, but as a map of how power behaves when it is embarrassed, how law functions when it is forced to choose between truth and stability, and how women's boundaries are recognized only when refusal becomes impossible to ignore. The archive does not remember Big Nelly Webb because it valued her life. It remembers her because she disrupted a system. That distinction should never be forgotten. A final measure. There is a temptation, when closing a book like this, to search for a lesson that reassures. There is none. The most honest measure of this case is simple. A woman was forced to defend a door because the law would not reliably defend her. The law acknowledged this once. The town moved on. And systems like this continue, not because they are just, but because they are efficient. The threshold remains. So does the question it poses. Whenever authority presses too hard against a boundary it assumes will give. Who is allowed to say no, and what happens when they do? That question did not belong only to Edmonton in 1888. It belongs wherever order is mistaken for justice, and wherever silence is mistaken for resolution. The door still matters. And history, when it is honest, keeps standing there. Bibliography. Primary sources. Government and archival records. Library and Archives Canada. Northwest Mounted Police, NWMP, Personnel Records, 1873 to 1904. Government of Canada. Library and Archives Canada. Northwest Mounted Police, Personnel Files for Members of the NWMP, 1873 to 1904. Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Canadiana/Heritage. Irvine, AG. Northwest Mounted Police Force. In Annual Report for the Department of the Interior. Ottawa, 1880. Contemporary Newspapers, recommended for court coverage and local reaction. Edmonton Bulletin, Edmonton, 1888 to 1889. Court reporting, editor/publisher context discussed in later secondary scholarship. Winnipeg Free Press, Winnipeg, 1888 to 1889. Regional commentary on NWMP reputation and sporting life. Secondary sources. Bertram, Laurie. The Madam Who Shot the Mountie, How a Brothel Keeper in 1880s Edmonton Crossed the Law, and Won. U of T Magazine, June 25, 2019. Bertram, Laurie. The Madam Who Shot the Mountie, How a Brothel Keeper in 1880s Edmonton Crossed the Law, and Won. Active History, say, July 19, 2019. Bertram, L.K. The Other Little House, The Brothel as a Colonial Institution on the Canadian Prairies, 1880 to 93. Journal of Social History 56, No. 1, Fall 2022 58 to 88. https://doi.org/101093/jsh/chaussee018. McLeod, R. C. The Northwest Mounted Police and Law Enforcement, 1873 to 1905. Toronto, University of Toronto Press, 1976. Strange, Carolyn, and Tina Merrill Liu. Making Good, Law and Moral Regulation in Canada, 1867 to 1939. Toronto, University of Toronto Press, 1997. Carter, Sarah. The Importance of Being Monogamous, Marriage and Nation Building in Western Canada. Edmonton, Athabasca University Press, 2008. The Northwest Mounted Police. In the Canadian Encyclopedia.